heard from Thomas and the latest developments in Weston. It didn't take Robertson long to work out what she really wanted to talk about. "Finch next week?" "Yep." "You worried about your testimony?" "More worried that he's going to worm his way out of it somehow. I think something like this is beyond even his means. He wants his day in court because he loves the sound of his own voice, and it'll give him the chance to air his grievances. He won't be going anywhere." "I'm probably his main grievance," said Louise. "That you are, and that's a good thing. He wouldn't be where he is if it wasn't for you." Louise couldn't take all the credit for that. It had taken Amira's determination to really spur her into action, and the real reason Finch was behind bars was because of the Ghost Squad, who'd been running a secret operation on Finch for a number of months. She must be feeling fragile today. First needing to hear Thomas's voice, and now this pep talk from Robertson. "I guess you're right," she said, standing. "You were cleared of all wrongdoing, Louise," said Robertson softly, as if reading her mind. "For what it's worth, I believed you at the time, and I sure as hell believe you now. Finch is an arch-manipulator. Why he told you Max Walton was holding a gun, I don't know. I suspect it was because he's not right up here." Robertson pointed to his head with an absurdly comical look on his face. It felt such a relief to laugh. Louise couldn't remember Robertson ever doing such a thing before. He usually had a bone-dry sense of humor, and in a heartbeat his crazy expression had disappeared and he was back studying his screen. "Thanks, Ian," she said, receiving a grunt of acknowledgement in response. As she headed back into the main office, she caught sight of Simon Coulson loitering outside her office. "You here to see me, or just getting out of work?" Coulson smiled shyly. "I have the results back on the voice analysis from the phone call to the school. I rushed it through myself," he said, handing her a set of papers. "I appreciate that, Simon. Care to give me the lowdown?" "As we expected, the call was sent from a voice-over IP, so it's all but untraceable. It was a great idea to get Mr. Innsgrove to repeat the phrase used during his interview. I won't bore you with the details, but our analysis suggests there is a 78% chance that it was Mr. Innsgrove who made the call using voice-changing software." Coulson had given her some more details on voice frequencies and modulators, which hadn't made much sense to her. If he said it was a 78% chance, then she took that at face value. It would never be enough to secure a prosecution, or even warrant making another arrest, but it did give Louise good reason to question Carl Innsgrove again. She checked in with the patrol car as she headed back to Weston, and was told there had been no movement all day. The surveillance was due to end shortly, and there were no plans to extend it. The simple fact was it was too expensive to have a pair of officers watch the building of a suspect who at present was under suspicion for a case of arson. It was only the fact that a school had been an initial target and that explosive devices were being used that she'd been able to sign off on the surveillance in the first place. Despite Coulson's 78% match, it was unlikely Robertson, or those above him, would be willing to keep spending money on it. She was there in 30 minutes, dropping off a couple of petrol station coffees to the two officers. "So you've not seen him all day?" "Hasn't left since we last spoke. We do an hourly patrol around the building, but there's only one way in and one way out," said the driver. Louise knew that wasn't strictly true. There were a number of alarmed fire exits, as well as numerous ground floor windows someone could leave from, but she didn't push the point. "Okay, I'm going up. One of you around the back, please," said Louise, heading towards the entrance. She hadn't called ahead, not wanting to give Innsgrove the chance to prepare his story. If she could speak to him alone, instill in him how serious it was that his speech patterns were a 78% match for the emergency call, then perhaps she could finally get some answers. It would be good to head into the weekend with a victory of sorts, especially considering what lay in store next week. The lift smelled of damp and cigarettes, despite the large no smoking signs plastered up on all sides. It was a relief when the door pinged open and she reached the relative fresh air of the hallway. She knocked 3 times, calling Mr. Innsgrove's name when he didn't answer. Louise had been concerned this would happen. She called the number they had for Innsgrove, which rang 7 times before going to answer phone, and knocked on the door once more. Innsgrove's neighbour, a young pregnant woman, opened her door and looked out. "What's all the noise?" "Sorry, Ma'am, D.I. Blackwell. I'm trying to speak to Mr. Innsgrove. Have you seen him today?" said Louise, displaying her warrant card. "No, I heard him playing his music earlier. I've been out." "Do you happen to have a key for him?" "No," said the woman, frowning at Louise as if she'd asked something preposterous, before slamming her door shut. "Mr. Innsgrove, please," said Louise, banging on the door once more. With still no answer, she called down to the 2 officers to double-check there had been no movement. Innsgrove wasn't a prisoner and hadn't been told to stay in his apartment. The reason she had put a team on him was more to see what his next movements would be, rather than a means of ensuring he stayed at home. She considered calling Mrs. Harrison, whom Innsgrove had put down as his emergency contact, but didn't want to get her involved yet. Instead, she called Robertson and explained the situation. "Do you think he's in danger?" asked Robertson, giving an effective green light for her to break down the man's door. "He doesn't appear to have left the building and isn't answering his phone. Considering everything that has happened of late, I am concerned for his well-being," said Louise, making sure she covered every base before going ahead. "I agree," said Robertson. Louise called the patrol team up, instructing that they bring the battering ram with them. She tried Innsgrove's phone again before banging on the door, once more attracting the attention of Innsgrove's pregnant next-door neighbour, who opened her door, her mouth opening to speak, then closing it when she saw the 2 other officers running over with the battering ram. "Mr. Innsgrove, I'm going to count down from 10, and then I will be forced to break down the door, as I fear for your safety," said Louise. She counted to 10 and nodded to her colleagues. The door caved in on the first hit, the frame splintering into pieces from the impact. Louise was the first through the door, a familiar smell greeting her as she stepped into Innsgrove's living room. Something coppery and acrid hanging in the air, and immediately Louise was on alert. She withdrew her baton, her 2 colleagues following her inside. "Hold your positions," said Louise, fearing the worst and not wanting to contaminate a potential crime scene. It wasn't the smell of blood, but rather the sound of dripping water that led her to the bathroom. She prized open the door with her baton. She didn't need to check the body in the bath to know Carl Innsgrove was dead. His corpse sat in a pool of maroon liquid, a long vertical incision on his left wrist. On the bathroom floor was a cutthroat razor without the safety shield. The bath was 3/4 full, and although the tap was still dripping, there wasn't enough of a flood risk to necessitate her switching it off. Instead, Louise tiptoed backwards, instructing her colleagues to call it in. As she moved backwards, she caught sight of an addressed envelope on the dining table. Unable to read the inscription on the front from her angle, she considered reaching over and opening it before deciding against it. Although the death had all the hallmarks of a suicide, it could be something else, and the letter could hold some important forensic information, so would have to be dealt with by the Sockos. "Secure the entry to the whole building. I don't want anyone coming in or leaving," she said to her colleagues. Until she was told that suicide was confirmed, she had to treat it as a suspicious death, and didn't want a potential witness or even attacker leaving before someone had spoken to them. The Sockos arrived within the hour. Louise was on friendly terms with the head of the team, Janice Sutton, and asked her if someone could process the note as a priority. "Let's get set up in the bathroom first, and I'll handle it personally for you," said Janice, who understood the pressure Louise was under. It was 30 minutes before Louise received the note. The envelope was addressed to Mrs. Harrison, and Louise gave Janice permission to open it. She did as instructed, photographing the letter, and sent it to Louise's phone. "Dear Joanne, I never thought things would end this way. I only wanted to help. Thank you for everything you gave to me over the years. It was a pleasure working at the school, and I am sorry for the distress I must have caused to the staff, the children, and most importantly, you. Whatever you do, please do not open the school Monday. Yours, forever, Carl." Chapter 19. Outside, night had descended. The still air was filled with the smell of marijuana and cigarette smoke. The residents were growing restless as more emergency vehicles arrived. Louise joined Tracy, who was sharing a cigarette with Greg Farrell. Seeing Farrell reminded her that she hadn't called Thomas since speaking to him earlier. "Thought you'd still be in Thornbury," she said to Farrell. "This sounds much more exciting," said Farrell, "and we're all but wrapped up there." "Thomas okay?" asked Louise, watching the pair for an exchange of looks. "Decided not to arrest him this time," said Farrell, receiving a chuckle from Tracy. "Glad you can see the funny side of it," said Louise. "What do you think? Was it planted?" "If it wasn't during the raid. The depot was covered with CCTV cameras. Your boyfriend's doing, apparently. And I've watched the attack numerous times from various angles, and they just smashed the place up." "Good timing on their part," said Tracy. "Exactly. We did get a bit of luck. The covering came off one of the number plates and we got a partial match. Looking at that at the moment." "Any idea who the attackers were?" asked Louise. "Everyone is playing dumb about the drugs, but I'd be amazed if there wasn't a link. Either suppliers or rivals." "Rivals?" "Thomas got his work cut out there. We've had to block all the vans and lorries leaving his depot until we've searched the whole place. He wasn't best pleased, and neither were his bosses." Louise rubbed her brow. The job had been going so well for him, and now this. It made her feel guilty for the lackluster way she'd reacted to his suggestion of getting the kids to meet. He was astute enough to have noticed her reluctance, and this would be an extra problem he wouldn't want to deal with. "I'll call him." "What's the latest?" said Tracy, finishing her cigarette and extinguishing it on the ground with the sole of her shoe. For a second, Louise thought she was asking about her relationship with Thomas, before remembering the corpse in the bathtub. "Everything points to suicide. We'll know for sure after the post-mortem." "And the note?" "That is a massive headache we could do without. Robbo's talking to the brass about it. I'm waiting for the CTU, and I need to tell Mrs. Harrison all about this. You take over here, Trace." Tracy nodded. "You need some company?" asked Farrell. "I'm okay. Best I see her alone for this one," said Louise. She called Thomas as she headed for her car, sidestepping an ongoing argument between a uniformed officer and two women who were trying to get back inside. She offered her colleague a nod of encouragement as she placed her phone back in her pocket, Thomas not answering. Louise thought about the note as she drove to the home address for Mrs. Harrison in Congressbury, which was a short journey along the A370 from Whirl. It created more questions than answers. Notwithstanding the implied threat that there would be another explosion on Monday, the note hadn't mentioned Louise specifically. The note found at the school had included her name, and the caller, who was more than likely Innsgrove, had also used her name directly. So why had he not used it now? The absence of her name on the suicide note would make it easier to justify her position on the investigation, but it also made her wonder if she'd been approaching things the wrong way. Louise pulled up outside a small cottage in the heart of the village. The front garden was adorned with plants and bushes that Louise imagined would look spectacular in the daytime. Although it was June, the air had an autumnal feel, the smell of burning wood drifting towards her as she knocked on the door. This was the job all police officers dreaded. Even though Mrs. Harrison wasn't related to Innsgrove, there was no telling what her reaction would be to the news of his death, especially considering recent events. The sound of dogs barking accompanied footsteps. Then Mrs. Harrison opened the door and took a couple of seconds to realize who was there. "D.I. Blackwell," she said hesitantly. "Mrs. Harrison, can I come in?" "Of course. What's this about?" asked Mrs. Harrison, her confusion growing to concern. Louise waited until they were in the living room and Mrs. Harrison was sitting down to tell her the news. She studied the head teacher as she told her of Carl Innsgrove's death. The evident shock was soon replaced by disbelief. "When? How? I only saw him this morning." "I needed to speak to Mr. Innsgrove. When he didn't answer my phone call, I decided to visit him in his flat. That was when I discovered his body." What happened?" "It's still too early to know for sure. But it appears that Mr. Innsgrove took his own life, sometime earlier today." A high-pitched sound escaped Mrs. Harrison's lips as she processed this information. "Suicide? No, I can't believe—" "Wait, how did you find him? Was the door open?" "I had grounds to be concerned about Mr. Innsgrove's safety and decided to force down his door." "You!" shouted Mrs. Harrison, getting to her feet. "This is all your doing! He killed himself because you arrested him! In front of our parents, for crying out loud!" Louise remained sitting. "Please, Mrs. Harrison, take a seat." "Why did you think he was in danger?" Mrs. Harrison was still shouting, her body rigid as she thrust her chin towards Louise. The gesture was reminiscent of the caretaker, and the image of him in the bathtub flashed into Louise's mind. She blinked away the sight of the maroon bathwater, the savage incision in the man's wrist, and the blood-splattered walls. "Please, this isn't doing either of us any good. Sit, and I'll explain." Mrs. Harrison stood rigid for a few more seconds before deflating like a balloon and collapsing onto the armchair opposite Louise, as if all the strength had vanished from her body. Louise told her about the voice recognition match and the patrol team she'd had stationed outside Innsgrove's building. "I can't quite believe it. He was a troubled man in some ways, but he would never hurt anyone." "In what way was he troubled?" said Louise, stopping short of asking the woman why she hadn't offered this information previously. "I've known Carl for a number of years. We were at school together, actually. He's a very bright man." Mrs. Harrison closed her eyes for a few seconds. "He was a very bright man. But he lacked some of the opportunities I was fortunate to be given. That was why he joined the Navy. To get a trade, see the world. You know, all that nonsense." "Were you still friends with him when he joined the Navy?" "I knew him before he joined. I didn't know him when he returned. At least, not to begin with." "What do you mean?" "They sent him off to the Falklands in '82. To this day, he has never talked about it, but he must have seen some things that have haunted him since. When he returned, he couldn't hold down a job and took to alcohol, then latterly drugs. We lost contact." She sighed, scratching her forehead. We were once, you know, intimate with one another. That was before he went away. I'd had these notions about us being together when he returned, but that was a different Carl. It was only when I saw him 10 or so years ago, begging on the high street, that I knew I needed to help him. It's to my eternal shame that I didn't do so before. Louise showed the head teacher the note Carl had left for her, and for the first time since Louise had arrived, Mrs. Harrison began to cry. At first she just sobbed, but soon she was inconsolable, as if she'd been holding all her pain in for years. Louise wanted to comfort the woman, but she had to remain detached and professional. It sounded as if both Mrs. Harrison's and Carl Innsgrove's lives had been irrevocably changed by Innsgrove going away to war. In their own different ways, neither of them had come to terms with that and had lived in the shadow of that decision. Louise waited until the other woman had regained her composure before asking her if there was anyone else in Innsgrove's life they should talk to. Mrs. Harrison shook her head vigorously, as if she thought Louise hadn't been listening. He was a very solitary person. Like me, he regularly attended Holy Trinity. He used to help out there as well. Always busy. Always of service. Our pastor, Reverend Lancaster, loved him. He was a very quiet man, but everyone loved him. Anyone else you can think of? It would really help. There is a war veterans group he met with once a week in the church hall. Ex-servicemen like him. I know he took a lot of comfort from that. Louise was reminded of one of the photos she'd seen at Innsgrove's flat. Is this the group? She asked, showing Mrs. Harrison the picture of Innsgrove and the other 5 elderly men. Yes, that's it. That man there, Bryce Milner, is the organizer. The other man there, Ben Coles, is also a regular parishioner at Holy Trinity. I have Bryce's number, if that would help. Louise took the details from Mrs. Harrison before asking if she knew the significance of Innsgrove's mention of Monday in his suicide note. Mrs. Harrison broke down again, crying as Louise waited for her to answer. Innsgrove's death had affected the head teacher much more than Louise had expected, and it was a shame she had to push her so much. I apologize, said Mrs. Harrison, after a couple of minutes wiping her nose. No, I have no idea what that note means. I don't understand any of it. Are there any places in Weston that you think could be of significance to Carl? Mrs. Harrison shook her head, before a smile appeared on her face. I imagine you're too young to remember the Tropicana, on the seafront. No, I remember it. Even went there as a child. The Tropicana was the old outdoor swimming complex that had once captured the imagination of the young Louise, with its fiberglass giant pineapple housing water slides that, in retrospect, were anything but spectacular. The building still existed and occasionally staged events, including a Banksy installation a few years back. Carl used to work as a lifeguard there before he joined the Navy, though that was before it became the Tropicana. He was an excellent swimmer. I can picture him now, sitting on that high chair looking down on everyone. It's hard to imagine they're the same people. Funny that, isn't it? How we grow old. How we change. Louise thanked the woman, telling her she would be in touch about a possible school closure on Monday. As she left the building, she called Robertson and suggested the Tropicana building be searched for explosives. Chapter 20. Louise had suspected there was something beyond an employer/employee relationship with the head teacher and Carl Innsgrove. But she hadn't expected the story that Mrs. Harrison had just told. Due to their similarity in appearance, Louise had half expected to find out that Innsgrove was Mrs. Harrison's cousin twice removed, not that they had once been lovers. The sadness had been evident in Mrs. Harrison's eyes when she'd told the story. Louise hadn't wanted to pry, but it was clear the woman lived alone, and she wondered if in some way she'd spent her life pining over what could have been between her and Innsgrove. She'd come to his rescue after finding him sleeping on the streets, and had obviously struggled to come to terms with what had happened to him. That she so easily remembered him as a lifeguard, young and with his life ahead of him, was telling, and Louise hoped she would still be able to remember him fondly in the years to come. Thomas's phone went straight to answer phone again as she drove to the Tropicana. She regretted not being able to be there for him on such a trying day, the guilt over her hesitant approach to their relationship still playing on her mind. But with Innsgrove's note, it was unlikely she was going anywhere in the foreseeable future. Pulling up at the seafront, she called Bryce Milner, the organizer of the war veterans group Innsgrove had attended. He had a gruff North Wales accent. "I can't quite believe all this," he said. "You knew Mr. Innsgrove well?" "He's been attending our war veterans group for some time. I didn't really see him outside of the group except at church." They agreed to meet the following day, and Milner supplied her with the names and numbers of the other men she'd seen in the photograph at Innsgrove's flat. As she left the car, she caught sight of Robertson waiting outside the Tropicana building, his arms folded as he all but scowled at anyone who looked his way. "Going for a swim, sir?" said Louise. "Now's not the best time to test me." "How did you get here so quick?" "It's my superpower. What does it matter?" "You've been to Innsgrove's flat?" "Yes, I've enjoyed that particular shit show. Now, tell me again why we're here." Louise relayed the information she'd received from Mrs. Harrison. "You can't be serious," said Robertson. "We're here because this guy was a lifeguard in the bloody 70s. He worked at the school and the caravan park. It would make sense that he targeted somewhere else that meant something to him." "Why target anywhere at all if he was going to end his life?" "Could be that this was all planned in advance. You know how it is, building up his confidence, one step at a time. If we hadn't caught on to him, then who knows when he would have stopped." "But why now?" "That's something I'll find out." "So we clear this place. Then what if there's nothing here? Vacate the whole of Weston for Monday?" "I'm afraid that is a decision for upper management," said Louise, with a slight tilt of the head. "Don't push it. Nothing will be happening tonight, though, that's for sure. And we can't ask the army back in. Not on this evidence. We'll get a team here tomorrow morning, search the place ourselves." Louise walked along the seafront as Robertson headed back to his car. The Tropicana building extended onto the beach that was now fully submerged. The promenade lights reflected the rippling water, and in the distance the silhouette of Steep Home emerged from the sea, reminding Louise of her first major case in the town, when she'd tracked a vicious serial killer to the small, uninhabited island. She headed back inland, waiting for a group of runners to pass her by before crossing the road to her car, where Tanya Elliott was waiting. "Me and my shadow," said Louise. "What brings you here tonight, D.I. Blackwell?" asked Tanya, who was wrapped in a beautifully tailored 3/4-length coat. "I could ask you the same question. Did you follow me from Congressbury?" "Care to comment on the death of Carl Innsgrove?" said the journalist, ignoring the question. Louise had promised Tanya full access if she kept Innsgrove's name out of the press, which she'd failed to do. "Press office." "We know it was a suicide. Any note?" "Nothing that I can share at present." "Do you think Mr. Innsgrove was responsible for the hoax at the school and the fire at the caravan park?" You're nothing but direct, aren't you, Tanya? When she wasn't being annoyed by the journalist's interference, Louise held a grudging respect for her. She'd often thought that Tanya would make a good copper, and she was definitely better at finding out information than some detectives Louise knew. Just doing my job. The investigation is still ongoing. And the reason you're here tonight? I had to speak to someone. Tanya smiled as if she was in the know. Chances were high she'd seen Louise meet with Robertson earlier and was fishing for information. It's Tim Finch's trial date on Monday. Louise resisted the desire to walk away. She didn't want to discuss the court case with Tanya, but was interested in what she might have to say. I'm aware of that. You'll be there? Other cases permitting. You'll be giving evidence, though? Tanya knew full well she would be giving evidence. She was a pivotal witness in the charge of attempted murder. When called upon. Are you ready to relive what happened at the Walton farm? Louise hadn't expected the question and answered quickly. Did you speak to Finch? She asked. I can't divulge my sources, Louise, you know that. He's not a source, Tanya. He's a psychotic woman-hater, said Louise, regretting the words as they left her mouth. That was off the record, and I'm leaving. Tanya waited until Louise had reached her car before calling over. Is it true your former colleague Thomas Ireland was the subject of an arrest today for suspected drug running? Louise stopped in her tracks. Her body was rigid, a pain spreading from her left shoulder to her neck. Why do you do this, Tanya? From the beginning, I have helped your career. We could be allies rather than enemies, she said, walking back towards the journalist until she was close enough to smell the perfume on the woman. Tanya instinctively took a step back. I don't think we're enemies. Thomas has been arrested and you know that. Why waste my time? But you are in a relationship with him. Louise lowered her eyes. Whether we are together or not is immaterial, and that's all you're getting from me. Anything else, you go through the press office. Aren't you worried that Finch will use this to discredit you? Said Tanya. Louise ignored the comment, getting in her car and driving off, before she had the chance to say or do something else she regretted. By the time she returned to Carlinsgrove's block of flats, his body was being placed into the back of an ambulance for transport to the mortuary. Residents were being allowed in and out now, and in a few hours there would be no evidence that anything had happened in the building that day. Sarko's are still going through all his possessions, said Tracy as she walked over. Louise updated her on her meeting with Mrs. Harrison and the possibility that the Tropicana building could be a potential target. There are a couple of people who would be interested in hearing about that, I'm afraid. CTU. Got here 10 minutes ago. I've stopped them going into the flat, and I don't know where they've got to. They were keen to speak to you directly. I'm sure they'll find me when they're ready, said Louise, noticing Farrell by the entrance to the flats. Excuse me, she added, walking over to the DS. Greg, can I have a word? Farrell nodded. Of course. You didn't have any contact with Tanya Elliott today, did you? No, not really. She was in Thornbury earlier, but I didn't talk to her. Check if any of your team spoke to her, would you? Said Louise, telling him about Tanya's accusation regarding Thomas. Jesus. I'll find out who spoke to her. Obviously we're not treating Tom as a suspect, said Farrell, as the two CTU officers rounded the corner. I'll go help Tracy, he added, walking off. Tough day, said D.I. David Faulkner with his practiced smile. You could say that. I presume you've heard about everything? We've read the note, said Evelyn. Any idea of what he means about Monday? Louise told them about her conversation with Mrs. Harrison and what she'd said about the Tropicana building. It's vague, I know, but it was important to him. The CTU officers exchanged a look. Are you going to examine the site? Asked Faulkner. Above my pay grade, but I am hoping we'll start tomorrow, unless you have any suggestions. Do you think Mr. Insgrove could have been working with someone? Asked Evelyn. It has crossed my mind, though nothing suggests it. He was quite an isolated figure. Aside from Mrs. Harrison, we don't know of any close friendships. That said, he was a popular figure at the school and the caravan site. Any correspondence aside from the suicide note? The Sockos will keep us informed. His laptop has been sent along for analysis. Headquarters? Asked Evelyn. Yes, Simon Coulson. We already know it hasn't been used in the last 4 years. Evelyn glanced over at her colleague. We'd still like to assist with that, if we may. Anything you're not telling me? Asked Louise. It could be nothing, could be something. The fact is that there is a risk of an explosion somewhere on Monday. As you can appreciate, we have our eyes on a number of people in the region. We'll be speaking to them. Did you have your eyes on Carl Insgrove? Asked Louise. We're here to help, said David, as if she hadn't asked the question. I'll make sure we liaise with the Tropicana development. Sounds like a good place to start, though I would suggest another sweep of the school first. Would you be able to keep us in the loop with anything you uncover in the flat? Faulkner's charm fell flat on her, but Louise agreed to cooperate. Just because she couldn't see the link to a terrorist threat didn't mean there wasn't one, though she was convinced they were hedging their bets. To Louise, it looked like a last desperate attempt for a lonely old man to make his mark. From what Mrs. Harrison had told her, and certainly by his subsequent actions, it was apparent Insgrove had suffered with mental health issues that had gone unchecked. It was a familiar tale of neglect which, as was so often the case, could have been prevented. It was after midnight when she left the site. She wanted as many residents questioned as was feasible and needed to stay to make sure the job was done properly. She'd sent Tracy and Farrell home long before, and as she got into her car, it dawned on her that Thomas lived less than half a mile away. Such had been Louise's focus on the block of flats that she'd forgotten they were in the middle of Whirl and that her old bungalow was only a short walk away. She drove to his house, parked outside, and sent a text message. He'd given her a key and told her she could visit any time she wanted, but it didn't feel right to go inside now. He was either asleep or still at work. Deciding he would contact her when he was ready, she drove home, every now and then checking for a message that never arrived. Chapter 21. The next time Louise looked at her phone was the following morning, to answer the persistent ringing from Tracy. "Morning," she said, surprised by her own croaking voice. "Sorry to bother you so early, Lou. Just got wind that the business in Thornbury has somehow hit the tabloids." The news startled Louise, and now Tracy had her full attention. "I take it there's more to the story. Both you and Thomas are named, and not in a good way. They've been clever, but the insinuation is that Thomas is either involved or negligent." "And me," said Louise, putting Tracy on speakerphone and searching for the story online. "Not good, I'm afraid." "No, it's not," said Louise, finding the headline. "Killer Cop's Boyfriend in Drug Ambush Scandal." "There's misleading headlines, then there's that," she added. She could hear Tracy smoking on the other end of the phone as she read the hatchet piece that mentioned that Thomas had been questioned by police. The article went on to state that Louise had been cleared of any wrongdoing in connection with Max Walton's death. But she doubted many people would read that far into the article. "They've certainly covered all bases. Don't need to guess who wrote it." "That woman is a menace. This could easily prejudice the jurors." Louise was already thinking along those lines. Maybe that's exactly what she wants to happen, she said, before hanging up. She called Thomas as she changed, pleased to hear his phone ringing even though he didn't answer until the 10th ring. "Hello?" he said, as if it was a question. "Hello, stranger. Still in bed?" "Hey, I may be," said Thomas, sounding even more croaky than she had earlier. "Everything okay?" "Nursing a hangover of titanic proportions. I popped over to yours last night, but the lights were out and I didn't want to disturb you." "That's probably a good thing. Didn't get in till about 3. Had to leave my car and got a taxi from Bristol. Went with some of the guys to drown our sorrows after that shitstorm yesterday. Not a great look for the new head of security." "They can't put this on you." "Last in, first out. I don't know. I feel too sick to think about it at the moment." Louise paused. She didn't want to compound his misery, but it was best he heard it from her directly. "I'm afraid it made the papers," she said, telling him about the Hatchet article. "I'm so sorry, Louise." "What do you mean? This is the last thing you need before next week, and with what's going on in Weston at the moment." "Don't be ridiculous, this isn't your fault." "Well, if we weren't—" "Stop it. They would still have connected us." "Did you see Tanya yesterday?" "She tried to ask me some questions, but I told her where to go. Probably foolish in retrospect." The journalist was becoming a problem. It wouldn't be long before Robertson or someone higher up the food chain was on at her about the article. It was bad enough having an ex-DCI in the dock next week, and this sort of publicity made everything 10 times worse. "We'll sort it." "I tried calling yesterday," said Louise. "Sorry, I was getting so many calls I switched it off. I knew what you were dealing with in Weston, so didn't think you'd want to hear from me." "Now that is silly. Look, I'd better go. I'll probably be working all weekend now, but we can catch up tonight at some point." "That would be good. Think I need some sleep now." "Wasn't Noah staying this weekend?" "Had to take a rain check on that after yesterday. Rebecca wasn't best pleased. We'll have to do the meet-up with Emily some other time." "Yes, that sounds good. See you later," said Louise. Should she have been more supportive? Thomas had been apologetic about their names being in the paper, but should she have been the one apologizing to him? She was the killer cop, as the paper so crudely described her. If it wasn't for her and the Finch court case, she doubted the incident would have made the news. And then there was the guilt of feeling relieved that Noah wasn't staying over that weekend. What was she so scared of? Spending a few hours with Noah and Emily in tow didn't constitute a marriage. It was a perfectly sensible idea that shouldn't have troubled her in any way. Yet she did feel relieved, despite knowing she had to break the news to her parents that she wouldn't be able to look after Emily that Sunday. "Is it true?" asked her mother when she joined them for breakfast. "About Mr. Innsgrove." She mouthed the last part silently while glancing at Emily, who was too busy eating toast to care what anyone was saying. "I'm afraid so. Yesterday," said Louise. Her mother stood up, her face breaking as if she was hearing that a relative had died. "What is it?" asked her dad, who had eased himself off his dining room chair. "They're going to blame you for this, you know," said her mother, stumbling to the living room to get out of earshot of Emily. "Oh, come on, love, that's not true," said her dad. "It is," said her mother with venom. "You pulled that poor man out of the school in handcuffs in front of all the parents and pupils." "I appreciate you're upset, Mum, but that wasn't what happened. He wasn't cuffed, and nearly everyone had gone home by that point." "Oh, whatever. They'll blame you, and then that blame will turn towards us and Emily." "Us and Emily," said Louise. "Oh, you know what I mean. Every time we come close to settling in, something happens. How do you think she's going to deal with this?" In the midst of all the drama, Louise hadn't given much thought to the fallout beyond what had been revealed in the newspaper articles. The fact was, Innsgrove had been the caretaker at Emily's school. Whether he was responsible or not for the dummy device and the fire, he would be mourned by the school. Her mother was right. Some blame would come her way. But she couldn't feel guilty about that now. She'd only been doing her job and had followed her guidelines properly. She had never wished any ill will towards Innsgrove, but chances were high he was responsible for both the dummy bomb and the fire at the caravan park. What she couldn't tell her mother was that the threat was far from over. Innsgrove's cryptic warning about Monday was still a major concern. Even though the man was dead, the fire at the caravan park indicated someone with the ability to trigger an explosion remotely, and it was more than feasible he'd set a timer up for Monday. And the fact that Innsgrove's suicide note hadn't mentioned her was still an issue. She had to wonder if Innsgrove had been working with someone else. "I'm sorry you feel that way, but we did the right thing in taking him in for questioning. No one wanted this to happen." "Try explaining that in the playground on Monday morning," said her mother, standing. "Excuse me," she added, before walking off. "Let her go," said Louise's father. "She's just upset." Louise kissed him goodbye, stopping short of telling him that if they didn't find something over the weekend, there might not be any Monday morning at the school. "That's the last thing you want to see on a Saturday morning," said Robertson, as they watched a van park up on the promenade in front of the Tropicana. "It does take away the mystery a bit," said Louise, as Lance Corporal Adam King left the van, which was emblazoned with the words, "Bomb Disposal Unit," accompanied by his colleague, Mitch Norton. "Louise, Ian," said King. "Thanks for coming, Adam," Louise said. "As I mentioned on the phone, hopefully we won't need you, but thought it best to have you here in case we do find something." After consulting with the council and the owners of the Tropicana, it had been agreed that the cafe on site would be closed for the day while they did a sweep of the place. "Better safe than sorry," said King. "Where do you want us to start?" Innsgrove's suicide note had begged the head teacher not to open the school on Monday, but Louise wasn't going to wait until then. "The school has to be the starting point. I know you checked it when the dummy bomb went off, but it's been open since then." "No problem. I'll head over now. Get your team to do an initial sweep of the Tropicana first. You know the drill. Stop if anything remotely suspicious is found." As King and Norton covered the short distance to the school, the area surrounding the Tropicana was cordoned off, and soon a small crowd had gathered nearby. There was a mixture of morbid curiosity and apprehension on their faces as the uniformed police moved in, coordinated by Inspector Dan Baker from Western Nick. Louise knew it was probably alarmist, but she would never have been able to rest if they hadn't secured the site. "Come, you can buy me a coffee," said Robertson, walking off down the promenade, ignoring the glances of anxious bystanders. "Is it wrong to hope they find something?" said Louise, handing Robertson a coffee she'd bought from the cafe on the site of the old aquarium. "I guess that would be a result. Unless he's got something else planned from the grave." "Let's hope it's just Monday," said Louise, glancing back along the seafront to the Tropicana. An uneasiness hung in the air, as if any second something momentous was going to happen. "A lot of people are pissed off by this. The air show starts this time next week. I don't need to tell you it's one of the biggest earning weekends of the year," said Robertson, snarling as he sipped his coffee. "So inconsiderate, these arsonists." Robertson shot her a withering look. "Don't think I haven't read the morning papers," he said, before taking another drink. What can I say? I love keeping local journalists in employment. Robertson sucked in a breath. Ever think you could just humour the woman? This is a hatchet job of the highest order. I've tried my best, Ian. I offer exclusive access, then she does something like this. It's the way she is. She's all about maximising readers, and it will only get worse with this book she's working on. Is this book on you, or Finch? It was a question Louise had been considering ever since the journalist had reappeared in town the other day. I think that will depend on the outcome of the court case. She'll need an ending, I suppose. I take it you've thought about the timing of all this, said Robertson. It was unfortunate that the Innsgrove case coincided with Finch's imminent court date, but if it wasn't that, there would be something else. As for what was happening with Thomas at Oblong, it was serious but would never have reached the papers if it wasn't for their relationship. I don't think Finch is masterminding all this from his prison cell, if that's what you're thinking, said Louise, even though the idea was something she hadn't fully eliminated. No, but I don't like all this happening at the same time. You need to stay focused. I've been here before, Ian. I know what I'm doing. I know. All I'm saying is don't let this distract you. I know it's important and that you'll do a good job. But Monday is important too. We need that bastard sent away, and for a long time. For you and everyone else he did over. For the police. And like it or not, Louise, you are pivotal to this happening. Louise pictured Finch in a tiny prison cell, plotting against her. But the image became much clearer when she pictured him back out in the world. Maybe she was being paranoid, but despite the overwhelming evidence against him, she still worried that somehow he was going to wangle his way out of things. Her character was going to come under question, and the newspaper article, with its exaggerated headline, wasn't going to make things any easier. But things went wrong sometimes, and although she appreciated Robertson's pep talk, nothing was going to distract her from keeping Finch where he belonged. Better get back, she said. You'd never think we'd left this town, would you? Said Robertson as they walked back to the Tropicana. I'm more of a local than I ever was, said Louise, turning at the sound of a siren in the distance at the same second her phone began to ring. Robertson had stopped in his tracks. You going to answer that? Blackwell? Said Louise, eyes on Robertson as she listened to the information given to her from the station. An explosion, she said, hanging up. Where? Not Tropicana, said Robertson, glancing down the promenade. No, said Louise, shaking her head. The school. Chapter 22. It was Saturday, but Louise called her parents anyway as she began running back to her car. Where are you? She said, trying to keep the panic out of her voice as her dad answered. Home. Everything okay? Louise threw the car keys to Robertson. Mum and Emily with you? Mum has taken her and the dog for a walk. What's the matter? You're beginning to scare me. The scar on Louise's arm began to throb and itch. Her dad had been the first on the scene on the night she'd received the wound. He'd already gone through so much because of her, and she regretted causing him any further undue concern. Sorry, Dad. There's been a fire at Emily's school. I just wanted to check you hadn't gone in for any reason. Jesus, said her dad, his voice dropping. No, they only left 5 minutes ago. Is anyone hurt? I'm making my way there now. Thank God it wasn't a weekday. Will you double-check they're okay and text me? I'd better not call Mum or she'll worry. I'll do it now. Please stay safe, darling. I will, Dad. Love you. Robertson was driving like a rally driver, and they made it to the school in under 5 minutes, guided in part by a plume of black smoke funneling up from the main building. He skidded to a halt on the road outside, next to King's BDU van, and they jumped out and headed towards the first of the 2 fire trucks, where King was standing next to the Assistant Chief Fire Officer, John McKee. McKee was handing out instructions as his team tried to contain the spread. "Went off as we arrived," said King. "Anyone inside?" asked Louise. "We're checking now. I've sent a team around the back," said McKee. Louise called the head teacher and was relieved when she answered, seemingly unconcerned. "I'm sorry to tell you this, Mrs. Harrison, but there has been a fire at the school. I need to know if anyone is due to be inside today." "What?" said Mrs. Harrison. "Please, it's important that you think. Does anyone have access to the school?" Mrs. Harrison began mumbling as if trying to order her thoughts. "We use a contract cleaning service. They were due to arrive this morning. They're from the council, so they have keys, though Carl is usually there to supervise," she said, her words trailing off. "There could be people inside. Cleaning staff," said Louise. "How many?" said McKee, summoning 2 of his colleagues. Louise asked the question to a clearly shell-shocked Mrs. Harrison. "They normally have a team of 6 or 7, she said, relaying the information. Louise hung up, Mrs. Harrison telling her she was on her way. Robertson took Louise aside. "We had this place thoroughly searched," he asked. "Adam and Mitch searched every inch after the dummy bomb, but the school has been open since then," said Louise, repeating what she'd said to King earlier. "That's why we're here," said King. "Better get onto the caravan park. Send a team over just in case," said Robertson, as the fire team began leading people out of the front door to the waiting paramedics. Louise rushed towards the entrance of the school, ignoring McKee's objections. She'd counted 4 people so far, all women. They all looked unhurt, bar some smoke inhalation which was making them cough and splutter. "How many of you came to work today?" she asked one of them, as a paramedic wrapped the woman in a foil coat and offered her oxygen. 6, said the woman. "I think Hannah was there when—" The woman hesitated. Louise couldn't tell if the tears streaming from her eyes were from anguish or were a result of the black smoke. "I think she was near the explosion." Another woman was led out, and Louise shouted over to McKee. "One more! She was possibly near the origin of the explosion." "We have this in hand, D.I. Blackwell," said McKee, who was in communication with his team by radio. Minutes went by without anything happening. The fire was under control now, the area near the entrance to the school clouded by the thick smoke. Louise began coughing, hot tears streaming down her face as McKee and Robertson ushered her back to a safe distance. "We're bringing her out now," said the chief. "Doesn't sound good." Seconds later, 2 firemen emerged from the shadowy smoke carrying a gurney. They walked steadily to one of the waiting ambulances, where the body was placed in the back and driven away. 15 minutes later, the call came in from the hospital. The woman, identified as Hannah Sanchez, was dead on arrival. Chapter 23. Greg Farrell adjusted his tie and took a seat in the CID office. It was a Saturday, but he was wearing his suit as usual. Appearance was something he prided himself on. Just as crime didn't stop at the weekend, neither did his professionalism. Following a house search on one of the drivers questioned in Thornbury the day before, an arrest had been made, and Farrell was due to interview the suspect, Lloyd Bradshaw, now. Although he didn't have a record for any drug offences, Bradshaw had been arrested twice on suspicion to supply, but both times had escaped charge. Some of the cocaine recovered yesterday had been found in his van, and that, partnered with his record, had been enough to get a search warrant for the man's flat in Knoll West. 1/2 kilo of cocaine had been found, and Bradshaw had been subsequently charged and brought to the station for questioning. Farrell nursed his coffee. After assisting Louise in Weston yesterday and the arrest that morning, he hadn't had much sleep. Now he felt a sudden lull as the words on his screen merged into one another. "Keeping you up, are we, Farrell?" Farrell turned to the source of the comment, D.S. Eddie Perkins. "You do know it's a Saturday, Ed?" Perkins smiled, but the lack of humour in his eyes suggested he hadn't taken kindly to the joke. Not that it was a joke. Farrell couldn't remember the last time he'd seen Perkins in on the weekend, especially since his old boss, DCI Finch, had been arrested. "Heard you got someone for that drug bust over in Thornbury?" asked Perkins. Farrell stopped what he was doing, taking another sip of coffee before answering. Perkins worked in a separate department and wasn't much of a cross-department team player. That made it evident he wanted something. "Questioning him now. Why?" "Just curious." "Just curious," said Farrell, incredulous. "Excuse me for passing the time of day with you, Greg. Sounds like it was a good bust." Farrell squinted his eyes. Perkins had barely spoken to him for the first few months when he'd moved to the headquarters. He'd been part of DCI Finch's team then, and it had become obvious that newbies were not to Perkins' liking. Aside from Tracy, Perkins was the only survivor of Finch's old team. The others had either transferred or left under suspicious circumstances. Farrell hadn't trusted Perkins then, and he trusted him less now, and wasn't falling for any false compliments from the man. "It was. Thanks for your interest," he said, turning back to his screen. "We had an arrest earlier in the year down by the docks. Similar M.O. A number of cars turned up, and there was a bit of a scuffle." Farrell recalled the incident, but didn't see the relevance. A number of arrests had been made following CCTV evidence that had revealed the assailants' number plates. There had been a suspicion that those involved had links to a local drug gang, but aside from a few charges for possession, nothing much had come from the incident. "You know Lloyd Bradshaw?" said Farrell, keen to find out what angle Perkins was trying to take with him. "Bit of a lowlife. Came across him a few times before. Wriggly little bastard, always seems to get out of it." Farrell could have accused Perkins' old boss of the same thing up until his arrest last year. "Okay, well, thanks, Ed. If you have anything specific you think can help, then let me know." "Sure thing," said Perkins, walking away. That was fucking weird, said Farrell to himself as he closed down his computer and went in search of more caffeine. Tracy was in the staff kitchen area filling a flask with coffee. "Leave some of that for me, will you?" Farrell asked. "Have you heard?" said Tracy, leaving a cupful of unappetizing-looking brown liquid swirling in the bottom of the pot. "What?" said Farrell, frowning as he poured the lukewarm coffee into his mug. "There's been another explosion in Weston. This time, someone died." "Shit. So that's where you're off to with all my coffee?" "It's a long journey. You not coming?" "No, I'm still dealing with this Thornbury case. Made an arrest first thing this morning." "So I heard. Must have been weird speaking to Thomas yesterday." "He was cool about it. Knew what I was going to say before I'd even asked the questions." Farrell had known Thomas ever since his probationary years on the streets of Weston. Thomas had been in CID back then and held the sort of position Farrell had targeted. They'd clashed at times, and Farrell had to concede most of that had been due to his own youthful arrogance. They'd been getting on much better by the time Thomas resigned, and although by then they'd worked in different towns, Farrell had been sorry to see him go. "I take it you've seen the newspaper this morning?" "I wouldn't call it a newspaper, but I've seen it. Timing couldn't be worse, I guess. I'll speak to public relations, see if we can put something out that takes the heat off Thomas and Louise. I'm going to interview Bradshaw now. Hopefully that will help." Tracy nodded. "Thanks, Greg." It wasn't surprising Tracy had survived the cull of Finch's old colleagues. She was diligent and probably the hardest-working copper he'd met at HQ. Farrell knew she'd also had a thing with Thomas at one point, and wondered if that would make the news soon. Bradshaw was in the interview room with his brief. Farrell went through the formalities before asking Bradshaw where he'd got the cocaine found in his flat from. "Personal use." Farrell chuckled. "You must have some constitution, Lloyd. And the heroin in your van?" "That was a plant, and you know it." "I'll be straight with you, Lloyd, and you can ask your solicitor about this, but we have enough on you for a successful prosecution. No judge is going to believe you were holding that stuff for personal use." Bradshaw shrugged, his eyes blinking as he shuffled in his seat. He didn't look at his brief before answering, "Personal use." Farrell rubbed his chin and opened Bradshaw's file. "Been here before, haven't we, Lloyd? You know how this works. I see you're not averse to providing a little police cooperation." "I'm not a grass," said Bradshaw, turning to his solicitor for support. "I don't care what you are, Lloyd. All I want to know is where you got this from. Tell us who you're working for, and I'd be more inclined to believe the drugs we found at your flat and in your van were for personal use." The solicitor twitched his nose but didn't say anything. Farrell had expected him to request some more formal confirmation that charges would be dropped against his client. "No comment," said Bradshaw. "Think carefully, Lloyd. This isn't your first time around the block. All I need is a name. No one will know it came from you. Do yourself a favour, or you'll be up in front of the magistrates Monday morning." Bradshaw sat back in his chair. "I was holding it for someone," he said. "Good, Lloyd, we're getting somewhere. Who were you holding it for?" "This can't get back to me." "It won't, Lloyd. Just tell me." Bradshaw bared his teeth. "It's that bloody security bloke." "Security bloke?" said Farrell, a shiver running through him. "Yeah, he was there that day. Tommy Ireland." Chapter 24. Louise remained at the school, coordinating the arrival of Janice, Sutton and the Sockos, while Robertson left for Portishead in anticipation of further developments. The school was now potentially a murder scene. Adam King had rushed over from the Tropicana and was working with the Sockos and fire department to determine what had happened. King was the first to emerge from the school, dressed in a white protective Socko suit. He pulled down his mask and sucked in air as if it was nectar. Louise glanced down to the evidence bag in his hand, trying hard not to make assumptions about the contents. "It was deliberate," said King. "We found it in the school hall. I believe it was planted inside a wooden pommel horse. Military issue with remote detonation." He held the bag aloft as if the charred device within would mean something to her. "Remote detonation?" "Mobile phone. Call could have come in from, well, anywhere in the world. Similar in a way to the detonation in Qstoke, except this time the power source was connected to plastic explosives. I've taken some swabs, and a scene examiner will be here soon. We'll need the clothes from the victim as well." "Could it have been on a timer, or detonated by accident?" Louise asked. "Hinsgrove said it was happening Monday." She tried to shake the image of Carl Hinsgrove in the blooded water of his bath from her mind. King's eyes widened. "Timer, possibly. Accident, unlikely. You would need a charge to set it off. The call could be programmed in advance, so the auto-dial goes through at a specific time. Less chance of being traced that way, though the chances of that are next to nothing anyway. However, my guess is someone called this in." "But Hinsgrove could have planted this device and set a timer so it was called this morning." "Could have done so, yes." "And the explosives, where would you get them?" "If you know where to look, it's possible. Military contacts or the dark web. Not easy, though. We'll have a better idea when we get the results back from the swabs as to what was used. The explosion killed Hannah Sanchez. The autopsy will tell us more. This sort of blast, if she was standing too close, said King, shaking his head. The force would have just sucked the oxygen out of her. As for the fire, the explosion set light to the curtains in the school hall. That caused most of the damage. We got there in good time, and most of the damage is superficial, said Mickey. Louise had managed to question some of the other cleaners. The deceased woman, Hannah Sanchez, had been alone in the school hall at the time of the explosion, polishing the floor. I have to ask, said Louise. King nodded before she could finish the sentence. We checked everywhere when we came here last time, including the pommel horse. As good a place as any to hide something. Everything is on tape, so we're covered, though I appreciate that isn't much of a consolation at this point. It had been 3 days since the school had been reopened, which would have given Innsgrove the chance to plant the device. Thanks, Adam. Can you get this processed for me with anything else you find? Sure thing. I'll probably get the rest of the team down to help secure both sites. If we can, keep staff to a minimum. And it might be worth putting up an exclusion area at the Tropicana, in case there is something active there. Louise thanked him again and began making calls. The last thing anyone wanted to see was a part of the promenade cordoned off due to the threat of an explosion. But what option did she have? Better that than risk another fatality. Behind her, she heard commotion at the barriers set up on the road. She turned to see Mrs. Harrison arguing with one of the uniformed team. Let her through, please, said Louise. Mrs. Harrison stumbled beneath the police tape towards Louise. What has happened to my school? She said, her face ashen. My team has told me the damage is mainly superficial. The curtains caught fire and the explosion has caused some impact to the walls and ceilings, which you'll need to get examined. I'm sorry to have to tell you that one of the cleaning staff was caught in the blast and subsequently lost her life. Mrs. Harrison looked at her dumbfounded, as if she couldn't make sense of her words, before her legs gave way and she fell to the ground. Louise dropped to her haunches. She was trying to remain detached. She didn't know why the offender was involving her, but the note and the phone call were enough to make her feel, if not responsible, then somehow complicit in what was happening. Mrs. Harrison, are you okay? She said, signaling over one of the paramedics. The head teacher was breathless, her skin ghost white as her forehead bristled with sweat. The paramedic sat with her and took her pulse as colour began to return to her face. I'm sorry about that. Please just stay there for a few minutes. Get your breath back, said the paramedic. Louise sat down on the ground next to the headmistress and thanked the paramedic. This must be a shock. Just take your time. I truly can't believe it. The other day was hard enough. We've spent the last 3 days dealing with the fears and concerns of the children. They internalize these things in ways we don't often appreciate. Louise understood all too well. She'd seen it in Emily when Paul had died. The anger and resentment bubbling under the surface, and occasionally revealing itself in random acts of violence. It's not going to be easy, said Louise, unable to find the words to sugarcoat the situation. I just don't know what the parents are going to think, said Mrs. Harrison, looking at Louise as if only then remembering that her niece was at the school. What do you think? What do your parents think? Would you want to send Emily here on Monday? It is a terrible tragedy, but the school will get through this. It's such a wonderful little community. We all felt that from the beginning. That's why we sent her here. The parents will know it's nobody's fault. They'll rally round. Again, the image of Carl Innsgrove in his bathtub popped into her mind. She told Mrs. Harrison where they believed the device had been planted. "I presume Mr. Innsgrove would have had access to the school hall prior to his arrest." "Of course, but you're not suggesting—" Louise let the head teacher dwell on the situation. Innsgrove had taken his life and all but admitted to his involvement. Then a day later a device exploded in the school. What else were they to think? "He wouldn't harm anyone. He was so gentle. You don't understand." Louise didn't argue. She was content to accept Mrs. Harrison's denial for the time being. The headmistress had been through so much that week already. Innsgrove had meant more to her than she'd been prepared to accept, and the enormity of this happening the day after his death would have knocked the strongest of people. The only anomaly bothering Louise was the lack of a warning. The suicide note had stated Monday. The first incident had been a hoax, and the second time it appeared that precautions were taken to stop anyone getting hurt. So why had this happened now? Louise's thoughts were interrupted by the sight of Tanya Elliott talking to one of the constables guarding the barrier tape. "Excuse me, Mrs. Harrison. Will you be okay if I pop over there for a second?" "I'm fine, thank you." Louise tried to run as she watched the journalist interrogate the junior officer, her phone held out to record the interaction. "You know better than that, Tanya," said Louise, nodding to the constable to leave them alone. Tanya pressed the screen of her phone and placed it inside her jacket's interior pocket. "I could see that you were busy." "Is that thing on?" "No, I'm not recording this conversation, though I would appreciate a comment on the death of Hannah Sanchez." Louise lowered her eyes. It wasn't a surprise that Tanya already knew, but that didn't make it any less irksome. "It's part of an ongoing investigation." "Murder investigation?" "There was a fire in the school, and sadly Mrs. Hannah Sanchez died as a result." Tanya laughed, the hollow sound echoing on the stone walls of the school's forecourt. "Fire? How long do you think you can keep that going? We know the fire at the caravan park was from a detonation, and look," she said, pointing at Adam King's bomb disposal unit van. "For now, we're trying not to alarm anyone." "But shouldn't we be alarmed? Next weekend is the air show, and there'll be thousands of visitors here. Do you think the event should be cancelled?" Louise had to hand it to Tanya. She could dramatize any situation to its full extent. "We believe the person responsible took his own life yesterday. We can't confirm that at present, though, and I would hope that you might respect the situation and not print anything until post-mortems have been conducted on Carl Innsgrove and Hannah Sanchez." In normal circumstances, Louise wouldn't have shared so much, but the alternative was risking a scare campaign piece, which no one wanted at the moment. She couldn't confirm Innsgrove's guilt at this point, but she didn't want it to get into people's heads that there was still a threat in town. "I think that would be the sensible approach for now," said Tanya. Louise knew better than to thank her. Too many times she'd say one thing and do another. If it was in Tanya's best interests, then Tanya would print it. "There was one more thing," said Tanya, as Louise was returning to the scene. Louise paused before looking back, utilizing all her willpower not to snap. "What is it?" "That incident in Thornbury yesterday, the drugs raid. Any news on that?" "Not my case, Tanya." "But your boyfriend is involved." "As I said, it's not my case." "Do you think he's involved, though, Thomas?" "Don't be ridiculous, Tanya. See you later." "You know how this will look, don't you?" Louise stopped again. "Is this some sort of tactic they tell you about in journalist school? Annoy someone enough and you'll get a reaction?" Tanya laughed. Louise couldn't tell if she truly thought this was all a game. I want to get to the truth, Louise. It is DCI Finch's trial next week, after all. He isn't a DCI anymore. You'll be called as a witness. You were there on the night of the arrest? You know all this, Tanya. Spit it out. It eats away at your credibility a bit, doesn't it? What does? Said Louise, raising her voice. Sleeping with the accused, and then a man who may be guilty of drug running. Louise was used to this type of onslaught from the journalist. It was a technique Tanya had begun to master after her first success in Weston, reporting the pensioner killer case. It was taking all of Louise's strength not to respond. She had enough to worry about without having to deal with Tanya Elliott's provocation. Goodbye, Tanya, she said, before returning to the school. Standing by the entrance, she wanted to retch at the sulphur-like smell coming from the burnt-out school hall. She could sense Tanya's eyes still on her, and she stood straight as if demonstrating her resolve, when all she wanted to do was crouch to the ground and ease the tension in her shoulders and neck. An innocent woman had just died, but because of Tanya Elliott, Louise's thoughts were drifting to other concerns. She knew she couldn't let Tanya's taunting get to her, but what if she had a point? She had slept with Finch in the past, and, to a certain extent, she had trusted him. She couldn't believe she was thinking this way, but what if Tanya was right about Thomas? And if that was the case, what did it say about her? How could she be expected to run a successful investigation when she couldn't even make the right choices in her personal life? Her focus changed as she recalled Hannah Sanchez's body being wheeled out of the school building towards the waiting ambulance. Her role was simple. Find out who was responsible for this death and for the terror spreading through the town. Everything else, for now, could wait. Chapter 25. After his earlier revelation about his drugs being supplied by Thomas Island, or, as he'd called him, Tommy Island, Lloyd Bradshaw wasn't saying anything more. Farrell spent another 30 minutes pushing him for information, but he clammed up. Farrell wasn't giving his words much credence. Bradshaw would know Thomas was an ex-copper, and giving his name was almost definitely a diversionary tactic. He couldn't back up his claim that he was holding the drugs for Thomas, but unfortunately that didn't mean Farrell could ignore it. Thomas would need to be spoken to, and that would bring a headache of its own. Farrell's old boss, DCI Robertson, headed Louise's section. Due to recent events in Weston, he was also at the station. He felt like the right person to speak to about this. Louise would find out at some point, but Farrell wanted the situation handled as discreetly as possible. As he walked over to Robertson's office, one of the support staff called to him. "If you're going to see DCI Robertson, I'd leave it. He's in a foul mood." "Why's that?" "There's been another explosion in Weston. A cleaner from the school has died." "I knew that." Farrell ran his hand over his face. "I hate weekends," he said, ignoring the advice and knocking on Robertson's door. "The prodigal son returns," said Robertson, as if they hadn't seen each other since Weston CID had moved to headquarters. Even more so than Thomas, Robertson had been a mentor to Farrell from the beginning and had helped him secure a place in the CID after his 2 years on the beat. "Can I have a word, sir?" "Take a seat, son. What is it?" Farrell explained the situation with Bradshaw and Thomas. Robertson's face unreadable. "I'm going to need to bring Tom in for questioning. You need to look at what Bradshaw stands to gain from this first. Nothing else points to Ireland being involved?" Tommy Ireland. Farrell had never once heard his former colleague referred to by the moniker Tommy. He was sure it was an affectation created by Bradshaw, but he couldn't shake the chilling thought that Thomas wasn't the person he believed he knew. Given what they knew about his ex-boss, DCI Finch, who was in the dock next week, it wasn't an inconceivable proposition. Finch had managed to hoodwink people over a number of years. But then there had always been doubts about his character. His womanizing ways had gone unchecked, and the incident at the Walton farm with Louise had changed many people's perceptions of him, even if most had kept their negative opinions about him to themselves. The same, however, couldn't be said of Thomas Ireland. He wasn't exactly a stick-in-the-mud, play-by-numbers guy, but he had always been reliable and trustworthy. Farrell had never known anyone raise a concern about the man's professionalism, and that was one of the reasons he was finding Bradshaw's testimony hard to believe. "Nothing whatsoever. This is the last thing we need with that wanker Finch being in court next week. My advice would be to go for Bradshaw. Find out who he knows, who he's working with. Leave Thomas for now until we have some more information. Shall I speak to Louise?" Robertson shook his head. "She has enough to be worried about for now. Bradshaw is probably chancing his luck. No point stirring things up unless he can offer us some proof, which I presume he can't. Won't speak any further on it. Then follow normal procedures. Obviously we can't rule Ireland out, but I'm not going to start messing his life up on the say-so of this chancer." Farrell charged Bradshaw with possession with intent and secured a place for him until Monday, when he would be put in front of the magistrates. Although he agreed in principle with Robertson's advice, he didn't feel comfortable keeping anything from Louise. He knew Robertson wouldn't say anything, but things had a way of leaking in the station, and at some point he would have to talk to Thomas directly about it. He spent the rest of the day speaking again to drivers from Oblong. He never mentioned Thomas directly, but angled his questions so that everyone had the opportunity to name the head of security as someone who could have been indirectly involved in Friday's incident. No one did. The only further development came from an unlikely source. DS Eddie Perkins had been following up a lead on another drug-related incident in fish ponds when he'd arrested a well-known local thug by the name of Michael Sinclair. During the arrest, Perkins had searched Sinclair's van and noticed the back number plate had been blanked out. A quick check of the CCTV images from the attack in Thornbury had revealed that Sinclair's car shared the characteristic of a slight dent to the rear wheel arch. "You want to sit in?" asked Perkins after telling Farrell about the arrest. This was the second time that day, a Saturday no less, that Perkins had taken an interest in him. It wasn't Perkins-like behavior. They'd barely ever interacted, and Farrell wasn't falling for it. It could be that Perkins was trying to make allegiances, now that he didn't have Finch to rely on. But it was a little too late for that. "Thanks, Ed, but I don't want to step on your toes. I'll watch it on video and speak to him if I need to. You'll push on the Thornbury incident, though?" "Yeah, of course. Are you sure? Happy for you to take some of the glory," said Perkins. "Cheers, mate, but all yours." It wasn't magnanimousness stopping him from joining the interview. Whether Perkins was trying to ingratiate himself or not, the last thing Farrell wanted to do was question Sinclair about Thomas in front of the other detective. He watched the interview from the viewing room as Perkins interrogated Sinclair. Firstly, over an unrelated drug haul in Avonmouth Docks, and then about Thornbury. When Sinclair went to deny his involvement, Perkins pointed out they had CCTV footage. A less switched-on suspect would have mentioned that all the attackers had been wearing masks, but Sinclair wasn't going to be fooled by such a simple trap. "A white car? How many thousands of those do you think there are in Bristol?" he said. "With exactly the same dent in the same spot? I would say a total of one, exactly, and that belongs to you." Sinclair shrugged. "Why were you there? Why cause all that damage? Shrug. For the tape, Mr. Sinclair shrugged. Rival gang, perhaps? I don't know what you're talking about. A quantity of drugs was found in 3 of the vans at the Thornbury depot. My question for you, though, is why leave the drugs on the scene? You obviously knew they were there. Why smash the vans up? Why not take the goods? No comment. Good luck telling that to a judge, Sinclair. Your plate was blanked out when we came to yours, and the video evidence is enough to link you to the attack. With your record, you're looking at a stretch. Is that so? Help me and I'll help you. Why were you targeting the Thornbury depot? Farrell had asked Perkins to question Sinclair over the Thornbury incident, but it now appeared to be his sole concern. Farrell couldn't shake the feeling that somehow he was being manipulated, as if Perkins knew something he didn't. You know as well as I do that there has been something going on from there for some time, Perkins. Perkins appeared to be shocked by the suggestion, and it certainly didn't tally with anything Farrell knew about. None of the drivers had any previous, aside from Lloyd Bradshaw, who only had a caution to his name. And there was something about Sinclair's claim that something had been going on at the Thornbury depot that didn't sound genuine. He was probably trying to cover his back, shift thoughts elsewhere. But it sounded contrived, as if the whole conversation was leading to this revelation. Don't presume anything about me, Michael. Now, I'll ask you one last time. What were you doing in Thornbury? Sinclair leaned forward, as if he'd spotted some hesitation in Perkins and wanted to exploit it to his own end. Not so hard with your boyfriend around, are you, D.S. Perkins? He said with a snarl. I'm warning you, said Perkins, the heightened tone in his voice suggesting he was losing control of the interview. It's not Finch's manor anymore. No one cares about you and this, said Sinclair, throwing his arms into the air. Ain't fooling nobody. It was only there for a second, but Farrell saw the flicker of indecision in Perkins' eyes. This was clearly not panning out the way he'd intended, and his body was tensing as a result. Don't you talk to me that way, he said through gritted teeth. Sinclair looked up at the camera and smiled before Perkins ended the interview. Little shit, said Perkins to Farrell as they met in the viewing room. Don't let it get to you, said Farrell, bemused by how Perkins was, all of a sudden, treating him as a confidant. Just winds me up. Finch gets put away, and just because I worked with him, I have to deal with the fallout. It was the first time Farrell had heard Perkins mention Finch since his old boss's arrest. It was no secret that the Ghost Squad had been looking into Perkins as well as Finch, but they didn't have enough evidence against him to mount a prosecution. It made no difference to Farrell, who would always associate him with his sociopath of a former boss. But it was interesting he was mentioning him now. You have enough to charge, Sinclair? Not really. He's right about the dent in his van. Everything I have on him is circumstantial at the moment, but I know he was at the scene. Sorry I couldn't help you more. You tried, Ed. Appreciate it. But Farrell didn't appreciate it. Perkins had pushed his hand a little too far at the end, making it so obvious that he was trying to do Farrell a favor. It was out of character, and Farrell needed to know why. It could be that Sinclair had been right, and that Perkins was out on a limb without Finch, but it felt more likely that Perkins was trying to force his way into the investigation. Did he know that Lloyd Bradshaw had mentioned Thomas as a potential ringleader? Farrell imagined that would be quite the success story for Perkins. Bringing down a former fellow officer would take away the bad feeling people had for him at present, and would banish the heat from his friendship with the disgraced Finch. Farrell decided to follow him as he left the station in the early evening. It proved to be a relatively easy job, Perkins making the short journey to a car park off the seafront in Clevedon. Farrell watched from across the road as Perkins paced the car park, smoking, waiting for someone to arrive. 5 minutes later, a sleek Mercedes coupe pulled up, and out stepped the journalist, Tanya Elliott. Chapter 26. Louise kept glancing at her phone as she left the hospital where Hannah Sanchez's body had been taken. Try as she might, she still couldn't get Tanya's words out of her mind. The suggestion that Thomas was somehow involved in the drug operation was laughable. But still she'd let Tanya's words get to her. What she should have done was call Thomas and checked he was okay. So why was she hesitating? Her natural instincts were to suspect everyone. And what if she heard something in his voice? What if the last few months had all been a lie? After viewing the body of Hannah Sanchez, it was now her duty to inform the woman's family. A second death notice in less than a week would be hard for any officer to contend with, and Louise couldn't help but shoulder the responsibility. That first note at the school had contained her name, and the caller had mentioned her specifically. That alone made her culpable. It could all be a distraction, but if the offender was doing this simply to hurt her, then she would find it hard to forgive herself. It made the journey to Hannah's small terraced house in Yatton feel like a penance. Records showed she was married to a Marco Sanchez, who was currently claiming job seekers' allowance. They had 2 children in their 30s, Abby and Marco Jr., who lived in the local area. A man in a thick navy dressing gown answered the door. The smell of alcohol drifted off him as though he'd doused himself in it. "Mr. Sanchez?" she asked. The man took a few seconds to answer as he struggled to focus on her. "Yes," he said eventually, the word sounding like a question. "May I come in?" asked Louise, displaying her warrant card. The house was a bizarre mix of perfect cleanliness and chaos. Louise peeked into the immaculate kitchen area as she followed Mr. Sanchez to the living room, which was a graveyard of takeaway boxes and beer cans. "Excuse the mess," he said, slumping down on the sofa. "Please can we sit?" said Louise, proceeding to tell the man about the incident at the school. When she was finished, Mr. Sanchez twitched before standing and filling a china cup with a supermarket-brand whiskey. "She's gone," he said, wincing as he downed the drink. Louise nodded. "Is there anyone who can be with you?" she asked. "My girl comes around every now and then." "Your daughter, Abby?" "Abby," repeated Mr. Sanchez, filling his cup once more. Louise eased the bottle from his grasp and helped him sit down. She found Abby's phone number and experienced the pain of telling the woman about her mother's death, before calling a family liaison officer to attend the house and offer some help to Mr. Sanchez. Nothing suggested that Hannah Sanchez had been specifically targeted. She'd simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and for that, Louise wanted to give her family all the help she could. 2 hours later, Louise was standing outside Western General. Abby Sanchez had identified the body of her mother, and Louise had made arrangements for it to be moved to the county morgue tomorrow morning. Louise was debating whether or not to drive home when Greg Farrell tapped her on the shoulder. "I was told you were here," he said in response to her look of shock. "What are you doing here, Greg?" "I've had a hell of a day, can't deny it," said Farrell. He told her about the interview with Lloyd Bradshaw and his claim that Thomas was responsible for the drug running with the delivery company. Called him Tommy Ireland. "Tommy Ireland?" said Louise, hearing a hint of panic in her laugh. "You can't possibly believe him," she added, her thoughts turning to Tanya Elliott's words earlier that day. "No, Something weird is going down. You know Ed Perkins? Of course you do. Anyway, he starts speaking to me this morning, all buddy-like as if we're best friends. All of a sudden, he's found one of the drivers from the incident in Thornbury, asks me to sit in on it, then has the audacity to complain about his unfair treatment because Finch has been put away. Perkins was one of Finch's sycophants, possibly the last one left at the station. He'd been a detective constable during Louise's time at MIT and promoted not long after her departure. She hadn't had many dealings with him since then, but he'd always made his allegiances well known. It wasn't a surprise he was trying to forge new alliances now Finch was facing trial, and it wasn't a surprise that he was poking his nose into an investigation that was having an impact on Thomas. Did you sit in on it? I watched it. Something about it didn't ring true to me, as if he was going through the motions. The suspect, Michael Sinclair, turned on him at one point, which he didn't like. But that's not really why I'm here. This evening, I decided to follow him afterwards, and he ended up going to see that journalist, Tanya Elliott. Did he now? What time was this? About 8 p.m. Not long after I spoke to her last. What's Perkins playing at? Does he know about Bradshaw's accusation? Not that I'm aware of. So far, it's only you, me, and Robertson. But you know how it is. It could easily be around the station by now. Funny that Tanya had already asked me about it. She knew Thomas was head of security for Oblong, though, asked Farrell. Yeah, but she out and out suggested that he was under suspicion of drug running. This was before you'd got Bradshaw's statement. You think she knew Bradshaw was going to say it? That, or she thought someone was going to, said Louise. I'll keep an eye on him, said Farrell, looking away. It was obvious what he was concerned about, and she decided to rescue him. You're going to have to bring Thomas in at some point, I presume, she said. We'll make it as low-key as we can. I'll arrange to see him at work first thing Monday. Louise sighed. It was the last thing they needed at present. Maybe you should do it sooner. Any hint of favoritism will reflect badly, and with Tom and I— Understood, said Farrell, shaking his head. I'll guess I'll get onto it tomorrow. You think all this stuff is over now Innsgrove is out of the picture? I hope so, though I still don't know why he did it, beyond it being a cry for help, said Louise. And we still have the threat of Monday looming over us. She thanked Farrell for making the journey and watched him drive away before deciding what to do next. It was too late to go back to headquarters, but she was restless and knew she wouldn't be able to sleep. She knew what she needed to do, but was putting it off. She hadn't spoken to Thomas since earlier that day, but if she called him now, she would have to tell him about Lloyd Bradshaw's accusation. She decided to drive to his house. She considered herself an excellent judge of character who could occasionally get things wrong. But she couldn't believe she'd been wrong about Thomas. Even if it wasn't against his character, she just couldn't see how he would have hidden that side from her over the years. As she drove up the Locking Road, she reminded herself that all of this was to do with a lowlife who'd been found with cocaine in his possession. Bradshaw would know Thomas was ex-police and probably thought the accusation would benefit him in some way. That only made her feel more guilty. The fact that she was even considering Thomas's involvement said much more about her than it did him. Her phone rang as she was heading past Bay Tree Wreck. Hers was the only car on the road at that point, and the piercing ringtone made her jolt in her seat. The phone was connected to the dashboard, the name DCI Robertson flashing on the screen. Sir, she said, answering. Robertson's voice came out as a low-pitched grumble from the car speakers. Where are you, Louise? Driving through Weston towards Whirl, said Louise, stopping short of telling her boss she was on her way to Thomas's house. Keep driving to Portishead. There have been some developments, said Robertson, hanging up. Louise didn't bother ringing back. By the sound of it, Robertson had either just been dragged from bed or the bar, and if he didn't want to speak to her over the phone, nothing was going to change that. She made good time to headquarters, arriving to see the DCI heading into the main building. It was too late to call Tracy or Farrell to see if they knew what was happening, so she followed Robertson into the building, not knowing what to expect. Robertson had stopped to get a coffee from the vending machine and handed her a cup. She'd been right about him getting dragged out of bed. He was wearing jeans and a dark pullover, his hair disheveled, his eyes sunken. It was rare to see him in casual clothes, but she knew better than to mention anything. "Thanks," she said, taking the coffee. "Call came in not long before I called you. As head of department, I was alerted to it," said Robertson, as they took the lift to the CID. He took out his phone and played the message, which sounded like it used the same voice-altering software as the call from Innsgrove, despite the voice sounding slightly higher in pitch. "The explosion at the school will not be the last until D.I. Louise Blackwell has paid for all her crimes." Chapter 27. Assistant Chief Constable Alan Brightman and the 2 officers from CTU were waiting for Louise in the incident room. She was still coming to terms with the anonymous message as she followed Robertson through into the office. It potentially turned everything on its head. Not only did it suggest that Innsgrove was either working with someone else or wasn't involved at all, it confirmed that the party or parties involved had a particular grievance with her, which risked making her position on the investigation untenable. "The explosion at the school will not be the last until D.I. Louise Blackwell has paid for all her crimes." Louise didn't know what her supposed crimes were, but people had died, and she had to shoulder that blame. No doubt that was why she was there, and the walk to the oval table where the 3 were sitting felt never-ending. "DCI Robertson, D.I. Blackwell, thank you for coming in at this ungodly hour," said Brightman, who, like Robertson, was dressed in his civilian garb. This time last year, it would probably have been Assistant Chief Constable Morley who was holding court. Thankfully, that dinosaur had resigned after Finch's arrest. Brightman had a progressive reputation, and at the very least wasn't predisposed to a hatred of Louise. "Sir," said Louise, taking a seat and nodding to the 2 CTU officers. "You'll have heard the voice call. Seems almost impossible that it was pre-recorded, as the operator had a conversation with them. This, of course, rules out Carl Innsgrove, unless he is calling from the dead. Anything in your dealings with Mr. Innsgrove to suggest he was working with someone else?" said Brightman. "Nothing, sir. Innsgrove denied any involvement from the beginning. The strongest piece of evidence we had against him, aside from his connection to the school and caravan park, was the voice recognition analysis we did on the initial call." Brightman searched through his papers. 78% probability. "Sir." "You still think he was responsible?" The question was loaded. Innsgrove had taken his own life, and if he was subsequently found not to have played a part in this, then the blame for his death would fall on Louise. That didn't mean she wasn't going to say what she thought. Everything had pointed to Innsgrove's involvement, and she stood by what she'd done. "Up until this message, I believed he was solely responsible. I still think he's involved, but it seems he wasn't working alone." "Did Mr. Innsgrove have a specific grudge against you?" asked D.I. David Faulkner. Louise looked first at Robertson before turning to the assistant chief. She'd expected the question, and it was a pertinent one, but she wasn't sure it was coming from the right person. "With all due respect, sir, why am I being questioned by CTU?" "We're all colleagues here, Louise. Please answer the question," said Brightman. "Cooperation goes both ways, sir. They haven't offered me anything, and in return they want me to start answering their questions." It was a risky move, but she was fed up of being dictated to on her own case. Now that Finch and Morley were gone, she needed to make her position clear. She refused to be trampled on, and Brightman needed to understand that. The assistant chief tilted his head towards the CTU officers. "Well? What would you like to know?" said Faulkner, focusing his magnanimous smile on Louise. "First of all, you can tell me what your file says about Innsgrove." "We don't have a file on Carl Innsgrove," said DCI Evelyn Hartson, speaking for the first time. "Who do you have a file on?" asked Robertson. "Some information we can't share. We liaise with MI5 and are prevented from disclosing it. All I can tell you is that none of our intelligence suggests any attacks were planned in the area, and our subsequent information backs this up," said Faulkner. "And if you don't mind me saying, D.I. Blackwell, this anonymous call suggests you are a specific target for the offenders, especially if you take into account the previous call we believe most likely came from Innsgrove and the note found at Larkmead School," said Evelyn. "That's hard to deny. My niece goes to Larkmead School, though I have no direct link to the caravan park." "Do you think this could have anything to do with Finch's court case next week?" asked Brightman. Louise's focus so far had been on Innsgrove, and then, with the emergence of Justin Walton, she'd thought even less about the possibility of Finch's involvement. But she'd yet to rule it out. Finch certainly had connections in the criminal fraternity, and even from a prison cell it was feasible he could have some part to play. "My feeling is no, he's not involved. I don't think even Finch would stoop this low. And I don't know how it would benefit him to kill innocent civilians. It would be a bit much just to piss me off." "He could be trying to discredit you," said Evelyn. "Read a newspaper recently?" "That's uncalled for," said Robertson. Louise frowned. Robertson understood she didn't need protecting, but he hated the bullshit as much as anyone. DCI Hartson had been off with her since the first time Louise had met her, as if the events were beneath her pay grade. "I'm not ruling out Finch's involvement completely, but I would like to state that Finch's prosecution isn't solely dependent upon my testimony. Many of the charges are cut and dry, and the attempted murder case is watertight," she argued, despite her private worries about the case. "We can place Amira Hood at his house, and there is enough visual and verbal evidence to suggest that Finch planned to kill her. There's also all the other women he systematically abused, who were just as important in providing a successful prosecution. Even if somehow all this discredits me, and again I'm not sure how or why it would, Finch won't really benefit. And believe me, I'm not sticking up for him. But at this moment, I just don't think this is his handiwork." She decided not to declare her knowledge about Perkins and the clandestine meeting with Tanya Elliott. It might or might not mean anything at this stage, and she didn't want to cloud things further until she had more information. "Then who would have a grudge against you, that they would target you this way? What so-called crimes do you need to answer for?" asked Brightman. Louise's mind had been made up on that the second she'd heard the message. In a way, it was linked to the Finch case, but perhaps more indirectly than she might have expected. "I believe the caller is alluding to the incident at Walton Farm." "Where you shot an unarmed man?" said Evelyn. Beside her, Louise felt Robertson tense up. For all the talk of cooperation, DCI Hartson was being purposely confrontational. "I think what Evelyn means is when you were forced to confront the serial killer Max Walton. Isn't that right, Evelyn?" said Faulkner with an encouraging smile. Evelyn's expression didn't break. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything. You were cleared of all charges. I'm saying an unarmed man was shot, and it is natural that someone might be aggrieved by it. The question is, who? Louise wasn't inclined to share any information with the officers, but the way the assistant chief was looking at her, it was inevitable they would find out one way or another. Walton's nephew, Justin Walton, has threatened a civil case against me for Max Walton's death.
Did we know about this?
Asked Brightman, seemingly addressing the room in general. It is not confirmed at this stage, and I have come to understand that Mr. Walton will no longer be pursuing the claim, said Louise.
You've spoken to him recently? Asked Faulkner.
Louise wasn't about to announce to the room that Walton had all but tried to blackmail her. I have already questioned him over the explosions and his connection to Carlinsgrove. We checked his whereabouts during, after, and prior to the events in Weston. I didn't believe he is a credible suspect.
And do you now? Asked Faulkner.
Louise frowned.
Not really. I'm pretty sure he's a drug addict and is all but destitute. I don't think he has the means, intellectually or even financially, to pull something like this off.
But maybe if he was working with Innsgrove, said Brightman.
Or someone else, said Hartson.
What do we know about the rest of his family? Asked Robertson. At the time of his death, Max Walton had an estranged wife, Claudia Walton, and a 16-year-old son, Martin. The wife had suffered years of emotional and physical abuse from him. She was originally from South Africa, and they both moved back 2 years ago. Walton's brother, Justin's father, died 7 years ago, hit and run.
In light of this new information, namely the anonymous phone message, I think we should up our surveillance on Justin Walton. Are we agreed? Said Brightman.
I'll check on the wife and son, make sure they're both safely in South Africa, said Louise. I don't want to rule out the possibility that this is all diversionary. We don't know for sure that any of this is related to Max Walton. Thanks to Tanya Elliott, Finch's court case next week is making the headlines. Maybe the bomber is using this as a means to distract us, dredging up the Walton case to send us in the wrong direction. Louise hoped she didn't have to spell it out for the CTU officers. Despite their talk of cooperation, they hadn't given her anything. She simply didn't believe they didn't have their eyes on at least one person in the area. Faulkner smiled again, and this time it felt natural.
Very astute, D.I. Blackwell. Rest assured, we are taking this very seriously, he said, exchanging looks with Hartson and Brightman. As a reminder, we have officers risking their lives out there, said Robertson. We had a civilian casualty today, and that could easily have been one of my team. So if you know anything now, best share.
David, said Brightman. There is a group from Withywood in Bristol we have a very close eye on. Nothing points to them staging anything in Weston, but there isn't a lot of talk between them internally. As soon as we hear anything that would jeopardize the lives of your officers, you have my word you'll be informed immediately. That has always been the case. Always will be, said Evelyn. Louise wanted the meeting to end, but it wasn't over just yet. There was an unmistakable tension in the air, with too much being left unsaid. It was DCI Hartson who eventually broke the silence. I have to come out and say it, sir. I don't think D.I. Blackwell should remain in charge of this case. The tension in Louise's body returned. She turned her neck, hearing a click and a pop that she hoped wasn't audible to everyone else in the room. Despite Evelyn's obvious dislike of her, she couldn't blame the CTU officer. If Louise viewed the situation dispassionately, she had to concede that she was potentially too close to the case. The offender was now pinning the blame on her for the latest atrocity. If Morley had still been in charge, she would have been taken off the case, But the new ACC looked at her with his eyebrows raised, giving her a chance to explain herself. Louise took a deep breath. I appreciate it seems that I am too close to the case, but taking me off now would be a backwards step. What if this is what the offender wants? Me off the case because I'm the most knowledgeable person on it. Oh, come on, said Evelyn, sitting back in her chair in an overly dramatic show of exasperation. Louise leaned forward. The only thing that links me personally is my name on the note at the school and the messages. No demands have been made of me. And you think they're going to stop if I'm taken off the case? They want me to pay for whatever it is they think I've done. You think we should just do what the offender says because they think I'm guilty of a crime? That doesn't make any sense. She turned her attention to Brightman. I know that town and these people better than anyone, sir. It would be the wrong move to bring someone in now. It would cost too much time. I'm 100% focused. Brightman rubbed his chin. Ian? Louise's record speaks for itself, sir, said Robertson, as if the question wasn't even worth asking. Brightman nodded. We'll keep things the way they are, but I want a daily update, D.I. Blackwell. Understand? He said, clapping his hands once to wrap things up. Right. I think we could all do with some sleep. Tomorrow is almost here. Could have been worse, said Robertson once the others had left the room. How so? No one was talking about giving the case to CTU. That feels like progress. Robertson hesitated, and Louise knew what was coming. Have you seen Thomas today? No. I saw Farrell, though. Told me about the accusation against Thomas. Nonsense, obviously, but we'll have to speak to him. Farrell is going to speak to him, said Louise. And you? Louise sighed. It felt like an eternity since she'd seen Thomas. She understood Robertson's unsaid request not to speak to Thomas before his meeting with Farrell, and was sad to admit to herself that she felt a bit relieved. She didn't think Thomas had any involvement in what had happened, but she was still worried about seeing him face to face, in case she saw something in his eyes that suggested he was involved in any way. I'm going home, sir, she said. Chapter 28. It was only procedure, but Louise couldn't shake her sense of guilt for not contacting Thomas last night. It felt like a betrayal, and later Thomas would have to endure questioning from one of his old work colleagues about his role in a drug distribution scheme. Are you okay, Auntie Louise? Louise was with Emily on the beach in Sand Bay, Molly sprinting to and from the sea, barking at the small breaking waves. What do you mean, darling? You look pale, said Emily. Just tired, said Louise, who felt as if she was nursing a hangover, despite not having drunk anything alcoholic in months. It was the toil of recent days, and a combination of a lack of sleep and rushed meals. If the Innsgrove case wasn't enough, Finch's Crown Court case began tomorrow. She'd yet to tell Emily that she couldn't spend the whole day with her, and it felt as if everything was threatening to overwhelm her. We can go back if you like, said Emily, her face breaking into a look of heartbreaking compassion. No way. I'm not going to cut short a walk with my two best girls like that, said Louise, fighting her lethargy as she jogged towards the shoreline, where Molly was still barking at the tide as if she could reverse it. After breakfast, Louise called Farrell before driving to headquarters. Thomas had agreed to speak to him that morning and had attended the station earlier. How was he? She asked, glancing at her phone to see if Thomas had rung. You know what he's like. Pretty relaxed about it. He understood we had to ask him the questions. It's clear there's no love lost between him and Bradshaw, so he wasn't surprised he'd made the accusation.
He's offered us access to everything, phone and computer records, even offered for us to search his house. Obviously, we'll check it all to cover our backs, but it is as we thought, a non-starter. Louise gave Emily a kiss goodbye. It was always a wrench saying goodbye to her on a weekend, and she held on to her a little longer than usual. "Everything okay?" asked her mother. "It's just the business with the school." Her mother shook her head. "No, with you. Emily said you were poorly at the beach." "I'm fine. They work you too hard, even more so now you have to trek to Portishead every day, and you didn't even touch your breakfast." Louise was glad her mother had stopped drinking, but it did mean she had more energy to focus on other things, which now seemed to center around Louise's well-being. "I'll get something at the station. Thanks again. Sorry to leave at such short notice." Her mother followed her to the car. "When will you know about the school?" she asked. "The parents are sure they're going to close it for the week." "I think that's a matter for the school. I'm sure they'll notify you. It's just the hall that's damaged, so I don't think they'll necessarily have to shut it." "Someone died there, Louise. It's hardly great for the kids." "I know, Mum. Believe me. It sounds horrible, but life has to go on. You can't expect the whole school to stay off for the week. And I imagine most of the parents would kick off if it did." The last comment warranted a frown from her mother. "Sorry, I know that sounds callous. We're doing everything we can. I need to go. Love you, Mum." Her mum nodded. "Get something to eat," she said, as Louise pulled away. Louise took her usual diversion through the town centre before heading towards Portishead. Although she'd already been to the beach in Sand Bay that morning with Emily, she wanted a glimpse of Weston before going to work. She felt as if she was checking in on the town as she made a lap of the seafront, taking in the Tropicana, its cafe now open, before heading back towards Emily's school, where a building team had already begun work on the damaged school hall. She should have headed to the bypass, but decided to drive through Milton towards the M5. Taking this route meant she would pass the turning to Thomas's house. Her pulse quickened as she passed Whirl Wreck. It was ludicrous to feel this way, but she was nervous about seeing him again. It felt awkward having not seen him for the last couple of days, the uneasiness intensified by Farrell having questioned him that morning. Thomas wouldn't know for sure, but would have wondered if Louise had known about it in advance. She slowed down as the turning approached. Now she was in the peculiar situation of wanting to talk to him, while also worrying that any conversation would end in an argument. She carried on past the turning, deciding she was overthinking the situation. She'd been told not to speak to him, after all, and Thomas knew how things worked with the job. He wasn't the type of person to sulk. He would know she had been busy with work, and he would call her when he was ready. Besides, she had more pressing matters to contend with. But still, she checked her phone another 10 times before she reached the station. Crime didn't stop for the weekend, and the car park at headquarters was full. Louise still felt like a bit of an outsider every time she stepped through the main doors. It wasn't the same place she'd left a few years ago when she'd moved to Weston, but there was still personnel within who would remember that time and the fallout from Max Walton's death. And as unpalatable as it seemed, some of them were on Finch's side. They had been during the Walton case, and had even remained loyal after Finch's arrest. The majority of the officers at the station had been glad to see Finch go. Corrupt officers only sufficed to make everyone's jobs harder. But there was still the odd old-school copper who saw Finch's arrest as a betrayal, and Louise wasn't sure what camp everyone fell into. She was forced to endure the occasional stare and muttered word behind her back. She'd been used to it for so long,
but it never made it any easier. She was glad to reach the CID, where Farrell and Tracy were together in the incident room, staring down at the table. "What are we looking at?" asked Louise. "National news again," said Tracy, moving aside so Louise could see a small headline inside one of the Sunday broadsheets. "Suspected murder in school." A photograph of the fire at Emily's school took up a quarter of the page, Louise seeing her name as she scanned the article. "Where the hell are they getting suspected murder from?" she asked, noting Tanya's name on the byline. "Probably an anonymous source," said Farrell. "Did you manage to speak to Thomas yet?" he added. Louise shook her head. "Not yet," she said, a little sharper than intended, before updating them on her late-night meeting with Brightman and the CTU officers, and the anonymous message that had been sent to the station stating that Louise had to pay for her crimes. "Imagine if Morley had still been here. He'd have suggested you resign," said Tracy. "Even he wouldn't be stupid enough to give in to demands like that. Brightman was doing his best to be on my side, but I can imagine the pressure he's under. I'm worried CTU will get their hands on the investigation." "You think?" said Farrell. "This isn't a terrorism thing." Louise was pleased that neither of her colleagues had even raised the question of what her supposed crimes were. "Perhaps not, but that doesn't mean they don't want to get involved. With the air show next weekend, they want to cover everything. If we don't get something in the next few days, they'll either take the case from us or be forced to cancel the event. Can you imagine the fallout from that?" said Tracy. Tracy was right. Local businesses would lose thousands of pounds if the event was cancelled, and for an area that relied on cyclical trade, that would be all but impossible to contend with. Whoever had sent that message was putting all the responsibility on Louise's shoulders, and however unjust that was, it was something she would have to accept. Not that she was going to resign, even if that was an option. "I take it news of this threat is being kept amongst ourselves," said Farrell. "Yes, but I think it's out there in the station, and if the last few news days have taught us anything, it's that someone likes to talk. Tracy, would you be able to get Justin Walton in? I think we should get his voice tested against the message. Also, be good to see if there are any other relatives out there," said Louise, reminding herself that she'd yet to speak to South Africa. Louise waited for Tracy to leave before speaking to Farrell. "So, how was he really?" she said. "You haven't come in all this way just to read my face, have you?" said Farrell. "He was fine, happy to cooperate. He knows how this all works, so it wasn't an issue." "Must have been awkward for him." Farrell straightened his tie. It was a Sunday morning, and he must have been the smartest dressed person in the station. "He's not involved, I'm certain, and I'm not saying that because he's an ex-copper or he's... you know." "My boyfriend?" said Louise, the word still sounding awkward to her ears. "Yes. Bradshaw is deflecting and saw an obvious chance to take a bit of limelight off himself, and it's backfired. I've charged him and he'll be in front of the magistrates tomorrow." "Thanks, Greg." Farrell nodded, handing her the newspaper before walking off. It took a number of calls before Louise managed to locate the address for Max Walton's ex-wife. Claudia Walton had changed her name to Kim Rennick before leaving the country of her birth. Louise appreciated the significance of changing both her first and last names, understanding the desire to completely obliterate the person she'd been while married to Max Walton. She located the woman in Menlo Park, a suburb of Pretoria, where she lived with her son Martin, whose surname had also changed from Walton to Rennick. Louise called the local police office and explained the situation to a Detective Sergeant, Connor Graves, who agreed to locate and speak to the pair. Louise tapped the table as she spoke to the detective. It was hard to decipher from his clipped accent whether or not he was taking this as seriously as it deserved. She stressed the importance and urgency, and he agreed to treat it as a priority, while never once changing the tone of his voice. She hung up and rubbed her forehead where a headache was forming. She hated having to wait on other people. If she had her own way, and an unlimited amount of time at her disposal, she would handle every minuscule aspect of each investigation. As it was, she was already restless for Tracy to get back to her with news from Justin Walton, and Graves to tell her that he'd spoken to Kim and Martin Rennick. Nothing could be achieved by waiting, so she headed back into Weston, calling Mrs. Harrison on her way. As she'd expected, the head teacher was at the school organizing the renovations. "The worst thing is the smell. You take one step into the school hall and you come out stinking of a bonfire," said Mrs. Harrison, taking a sniff of her cardigan as they met in her office. "So you're planning to remain open tomorrow?" "Of course. It would take something extraordinary to keep us closed. We owe it to the pupils, and to Carl, to keep going." "Mr. Innsgrove," said Louise, unable to hide her incredulousness. "Carl Innsgrove was a long-standing member of this community, and we'll honor his death in the appropriate way. Even though he could be responsible for what happened here. May I remind you that Mr. Innsgrove had passed away by the time the fire started," said Mrs. Harrison. "It was a staged explosion, Mrs. Harrison, not a fire that got out of hand. We think it's possible that Mr. Innsgrove called us prior to the dummy bomb being found. As you know, he left you a note to warn you about a potential future threat." Mrs. Harrison pursed her lips. "That could have been for anything. As far as I am concerned, Carl never did anything wrong. He was clearly suffering from some mental health problems, and that, coupled with the pressure of the last few days, led to his untimely death." At least this time she'd stopped short of blaming Louise. "Did Mr. Innsgrove have any close friends he may have mentioned to you?" "Not really. He was a very solitary man, as I mentioned before. Why do you ask?" Louise knew she had to handle the situation carefully. Mrs. Harrison was blinded by her relationship with Innsgrove and was struggling with the concept of his involvement. "We need to rule everything out. It could be that Mr. Innsgrove was working with someone else. Was perhaps being coerced into behaving against his will," she added, hoping to pacify the head teacher. Mrs. Harrison considered this for a few seconds. "Well, I guess I could possibly understand that. However, I don't think he had much of a social life beyond working at the school and the caravan site. And the vets group, of course." Louise had been supposed to meet the organizer of the group, Bryce Milner, with his deep Welsh accent, yesterday, but had been forced to cancel after the explosion. There was no one else, no one he was closer to. Mrs. Harrison seemed to squirm at the very thought, and Louise didn't push her any more. She thanked her and was on her way to visit Bryce Milner when her phone rang, the number withheld. For a moment, Louise was transported back in time to the period when she'd first moved to Weston. One of Finch's little games at the time had been sending her anonymous text messages, and seeing unknown number on her phone always sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. "D.I. Blackwell?" "D.R. Blackwell. This is Connor Graves from Menlo Park Police." "Hi, Connor. Thanks for getting back to me so quickly." "That's fine. I managed to track down Kim Rennick. She has moved from the area and lives a good 90 minutes away, so thought I'd call her first." Louise sighed inwardly. It wasn't the way she would have done it. "What did she say?" "That's the thing. She hasn't been back to the UK since leaving, but her son, Martin,
He's 19 now, and he's taking one of those gap years.
He's travelling?
Yes, that's right. That's the thing, in fact. Kim spoke to him last night. He's been travelling around Europe, and for the last 3 weeks, he's been staying in the UK.
Chapter 29. Graves didn't have an address for Martin Walton in the UK.
They talk via WhatsApp, he said, as if that was an explanation.
Louise's mind was a whirl of possibilities. Could it really be that Martin Walton, now Rennick, had returned to the UK simply to torment her? And if so, why had he gone about it this way? She reiterated the importance of the situation to the South African detective. We need a UK address for him, and ideally a photograph.
I have a photo of him. He's on our database, said Graves, maintaining the same monotone speech pattern.
He has a record?
Yes.
Care to share the details? Said Louise, exasperated by the detective's seeming indifference.
Let's see. A bit of shoplifting, a couple of fights including a charge of ABH.
Louise was waiting for him to say something about arson, but he stopped talking. Is that it?
Last in trouble 2 years ago. He was under threat of a custodial sentence, so looks like he sorted himself out.
Could you send me the file?
Yes.
Louise took in a deep breath. Connor, I do appreciate your help on this. Would it be possible for you to travel to Kim Rennick's house and speak to her face to face? We need to find out where Martin is staying. One person has already lost their life here. If Martin is anything like his father and he is involved, this could get much worse.
I can do that, said Graves.
Louise thanked the detective before calling Tracy and telling her about Max Walton's son being in the UK.
Just left Justin Walton's place. He's coming down off something horrendous by the state of him.
Okay, wait for me there. I think we need to speak to him about his cousin. Louise rearranged her appointment with Bryce Milner from Innsgrove's Veterans Group and made the short journey to Bourneville where Tracy was waiting. The emergence of Martin Walton Rennick as a potential suspect changed everything, and it tied in perfectly with the last message. If anyone thought Louise was guilty of a crime, it would be Max Walton's son.
The last thing we need is another Walton hanging around, said Tracy, as if reading her mind, as they made their way to the terraced house where Justin lived. I have to warn you, it's not a pretty sight in there. And as for the smell, said Tracy, shaking her head.
Louise laughed, but as she entered the property, she realized Tracy had been underselling the place. The floor was a carpet of growing garbage. Crisp packets, pizza boxes, energy drink cans, and empty bottles of alcohol covered every visible inch, except where that space was taken up by a comatose human. The smell in the house was a torrid mix of body odor, weed, excrement, and urine.
Jesus, I should be wearing a mask, said Louise, trying to breathe only through her mouth. Watch out for needles, said Tracy, stepping over a young woman lying at the foot of the staircase. Walton is upstairs.
We should get environmental health out here, said Louise, as she made her way up the stairs, though they both knew that wouldn't achieve anything. The building was council-owned. The state of the place and its inhabitants was part of a much larger problem, not only in Weston, but nationwide, and Louise had to reluctantly accept it wasn't something she could deal with now.
I'm back, Justin, said Tracy, barging open a door to a dingy room with yellowing wallpaper.
Justin Walton was lying on a single bed. He glanced over at them before making a gun sign with his fingers and pointing them at Louise.
You've brought the killer with you.
Louise jammed open a window.
What have you taken, Justin? What haven't I taken? He answered with a laugh. Walton appeared to be naked underneath the sheet, his torso stick-thin and devoid of muscle. I need to talk to you about your cousin, Martin Walton, or Martin Rennick as he is now known. Walton couldn't have hidden the flicker of recognition if he'd tried. I don't know any cousin, he said, pulling the sheet over his bony shoulders. You know your dad had a brother, said Louise. Of course I do. You killed him, said Walton with a sneer, as the sheet rose up further until all she could see was his gaunt face, his skin pitted with blemishes. Louise turned to Tracy, who shrugged. Shall we take him in? She said. No, no, said Walton, squirming beneath the sheet. Your uncle, Max Walton, had a son, Martin. Yes, yes, said Walton, resigned. When did you last see him? Ages ago, when we were kids, before they left for wherever it was they went. South Africa? If you say so. It was Louise's turn to shake her head. Where's your phone? She said. Walton looked down to the garbage on the floor before reaching his arm out, but Tracy was too quick for him. I need a shower, she said, grimacing as she pulled a phone with a smashed screen out from a heap of soiled clothes. Out of battery. Are we going to find any message from Martin Walton on this phone? Asked Louise. No, said Walton, as if the suggestion was ludicrous. So you're giving us permission to take the phone away to be analysed? No. Right, let's get him to the station. Walton appeared to either be on the verge of tears or about to be sick. His pale skin appeared to lose another degree of colour. Okay, you can take it. You do know what's going on here, Justin, said Louise, softening her tone. Someone died yesterday. Someone was murdered. If we find out Martin had anything to do with this, we'll be coming for you. Aiding and abetting a murderer is almost as bad as committing the crime itself, and the courts will definitely see it that way. He messaged me, okay, on Facebook, said Walton, mustering all his strength to shout at her. Now we're getting somewhere, said Louise. She would have sat on his bed if it hadn't looked so filthy. Despite the window being open, the smell of decay hung in the air. When did you speak? A couple of months back. He said he was coming to England and wanted to meet up. And when did you meet up? Walton lifted his head. Good one. We haven't met up. When did he arrive? I think he got to the UK 4 weeks ago, but honestly, I haven't seen him. His number on the phone? Asked Tracy. Yeah. Great, where's the charger? Louise did a sweep of the house as Tracy waited for the phone to charge. The partygoers were slowly coming back to life, and she counted 8 of them as she went from room to room. She questioned them as best she could, their answers mainly monosyllabic, each denying any knowledge of Martin Walton Rennick, 3 of them even denying they knew Justin. The phone had some charge by the time she reached upstairs. Tracy was scrolling through Justin's messages and phone records. Call history's been deleted, apart from yesterday, she said. We have Martin's number. Tracy showed her the screen with a number on it. The contact was listed as M. Like James Bond, said Walton. You know, when we take this in, we'll be able to find your missing messages. Good luck with that. And when you last spoke to Martin. And with that. Louise sighed. If they had used an encrypted Wi-Fi app to make the calls, then it would be impossible to trace anything.
That Justin had deleted his records suggested he was maybe a bit more aware than he was making out. She took the phone off the charger and signaled Tracy into the hallway. "You going to call now?" asked Tracy. "No, he'll probably hang up the second he hears my voice. I was thinking we take it to Coulson and see if he can put a trace on it." "What about Hunky through there?" "We'll have to bring him with us. See if we can sweet-talk him into making the call." A crashing sound came from the other room, and they both turned and ran back inside. The sight was the most nausea-inducing thing she'd experienced that day. Stark naked, Justin Walton had tried to escape from the bedroom window, but had slipped and was now face down on the bedroom floor. Chapter 30. Louise brewed a fresh pot of coffee as she and Tracy waited for Simon Coulson to arrive. After his laughable escape attempt, they had arrested Justin Walton and taken him to the cells at Western Nick, where he was still recovering. He'd refused to cooperate any further, but once Coulson arrived, they planned to give him one more try. The station was a little sleepier on a Sunday than Portishead had been, the whole building manned by a skeleton crew. After CID's departure, it was more of a community policing hub, and without the energy of her old team, the place felt tired and run down. Tracy held Justin Walton's phone in her hand and was trying to retrieve his browsing history, to no avail. "It's as if he was expecting us," she said, as Louise handed her a new cup of coffee. "Or it's a procedure he does on a daily basis." Before leaving, they had called in a team to search Walton's place from top to bottom and had already been notified of drugs being found on site, though nothing substantial enough to suggest he was dealing. "Have you spoken to Thomas yet?" said Tracy, surprising Louise with her bluntness as she innocently sipped her drink. "Been a bit busy." Tracy smiled and nodded. "I see." "You see nothing," said Louise, smiling. "Honestly, you are foolish sometimes." "Me?" said Louise. "Yes, you. You've had the hots for this man for years, and you finally get together, and now you're going to throw it away over a misunderstanding." "I think you're reading more into this than there is," said Louise, crossing her arms. "Have you spoken to him since the attack in Thornbury?" "Yes." "And today, after Greg spoke to him?" "Not yet, but I've been busy," said Louise, annoyed by the knowing look on Tracy's face. "You know he's not involved in this. He would have to be a master of disguises to have got this past you. Us, for that matter. I've known him almost as long as you, and I know he has nothing to do with it. You know it too." "I haven't said I did think he's responsible," said Louise, a little too quickly. "Lou, I know you. You're always looking for an excuse. That pathologist guy." "Dempsey? Come on. He's a nice guy. You didn't even give him a try. Blamed it on the wine and on what was going on with your life." Louise had slept with Dempsey on one of her first nights in Weston after being transferred. Tracy was correct that she had blamed it on a night of drinking, but it had been a mistake, and she'd felt right to dissuade his further advances. "I was having a hard time of it." I know, but don't you ever think you might be this way because of Finch? You trusted him, or at least I think you did, and we know how that worked out. Maybe that's why you find it hard to trust someone now. Even Thomas. Maybe you're trying to self-sabotage your relationship, and this bullshit with the drug bust in Thornbury gave you the perfect opportunity to get out of giving it a try. Okay, Dr. Phil, you've been reading some relationship how-to guides or something. Tracy smirked. Maybe, but that's not the point. Louise laughed. Tracy was right, but her actions had nothing to do with Finch. She hadn't truly ever trusted him, though she'd also never appreciated the monster he was until it was too late. But if she was being honest, she knew she was using the Thornbury situation to put the brakes on things with Thomas. It all stemmed from his suggestion that the kids meet, though she wasn't going to give Tracy any more ammunition by telling her that. "Okay, I'll call him," she said, about to pick up her phone as Simon Coulson arrived. "To be continued," mouthed Tracy. Louise went to take a drink of her coffee before leaving it on the side. "Thanks for coming in, Simon," she said. "No problem. I hate Sundays, as a rule." From anyone else, she would have taken that as a joke, but Coulson lived for his work and appeared never to be happier than when he was in front of a screen. Louise reiterated the situation to him. "If needs be, I'm going to ask Justin Walton one more time if he will try and speak to his cousin on the phone. If he refuses, then I'll have to call him directly. If his phone is on, I should be able to get a location for him. Might be worth trying that before calling. As for the deleted calls and messages, that will depend on whether or not they were encrypted. And it sounds like they probably were. According to Justin Walton, yes. I'll try. You have the number?" Louise gave him the phone. "Under M." "Okay, let me get set up." "I'll have a final word with Walton," said Louise. "Your coffee," said Tracy, holding out the cup. Louise shook her head, the thought of coffee at that moment making her stomach hurt. "This is your last chance," said Louise, speaking to Justin Walton in interview room 3. They'd given him some food and drink, but Walton looked worse than he had at the house a couple of hours earlier. He was on one hell of a come-down, his nicotine-yellowed fingers shaking as he did everything he could not to look directly at her. "Tell us where Martin is now, and you won't be obstructing our inquiry." "I don't know where he is." "We have someone going through your phone as we speak. Not only will we find Martin's location, we will recover all correspondence between you. This will be your last chance to come clean about what you've been up to, your involvement with the fires." Walton's body tensed, but he didn't respond. Louise wondered what Max Walton would have made of his nephew. Max had been a large, burly type who preyed on other people's weaknesses for fun. Had he taunted Justin as a child and made him turn onto the path he was on now? Or had it been much more of an abusive relationship, like Max's relationship with his wife? "I told you I don't know nothing about any of it. Martin called me to see if we could meet up, that's it." It was pointless going any further. She signalled to the uniformed guard to take him away, before returning to the office, where Coulson looked as animated as she'd ever seen him, almost hopping on the spot when he turned his screen so Tracy could see. "I've got a location for Walton Rennick," he said as Louise approached. "Up to the second as well. His phone just sent a ping to one of the nearby towers. He's at the Hampstead Park campsite in Locking." Louise tried to contain her mounting excitement. If Walton Rennick had used his phone so close to Weston, then there was a real chance they could get to him and end everything before it worsened. "What are we waiting for?" she said, rushing to the door with Tracy and Coulson close behind. Chapter 31. Tracy drove Louise and Coulson to the campsite. In the car, Louise arranged backup patrol teams to remain on standby on the edge of the village, while Coulson tried to locate an owner or manager of the site. "I've a number here, Mr. Joseph Dolby, down as manager of the site," said Coulson, showing Louise the number, which she punched into her phone. "Hello," came the reply 4 rings later. Louise introduced herself to Mr. Dolby, who confirmed he was the site manager. "I'm at home now," he said. "Is anyone on site at present?" asked Louise, her body straining against her seatbelt as Tracy took a corner at an alarming speed. "Not today. I'm down as an emergency contact and for bookings. I make a stop in the morning and I'm due over there at 6 tonight.
We only serve campers and those with motorhomes. Nothing fixed on site.
Do you have a list of who is staying on site?
Yes, at least I have the names of those who booked. They're supposed to tell us everyone who is staying, but especially with those in tents, it isn't always the case, said Dolby, echoing the words of the site owner in Qstoke.
Do you have the name Martin Rennick or Martin Walton registered?
Bear with me, said Dolby, the line going quiet.
Less than half a mile away now, Lou. Sir, are you there? Said Louise.
Yes, sorry. No, no one by the name of Walton or Rennick, though, as I said, that doesn't mean they're not there.
Louise asked Mr. Dolby to join them as Tracy drove down the dirt track towards the site. The place was a stark contrast to the caravan park in Qstoke. The campsite was literally a boarded-off field, with a small tarmac area for cars and motorhomes. As she left the car, Louise counted 30 tents spread out in random patterns on the field. She imagined it must be cheap to stay there, as she couldn't see any other attraction. The air was full of the smell of muck spreading from a nearby farm, and to the east you could both see and hear the traffic on the motorway.
"Any luck?" she said to Coulson, who was checking the latest tracking information on his iPad. "It's offline at the moment, possibly on airplane mode, but its last location was definitely here, and that was 20 minutes ago."
"Best get knocking on some doors," said Louise, stepping out onto the field, thankful that it hadn't been raining recently as she tromped over the dry mud. She tried a few empty tents before reaching a group of young men who had made a mini village of 6 tents next to the dilapidated toilet block. Sitting on deck chairs, sipping energy drinks and cans of lager, they had the same wide-eyed look she'd seen on Justin Walton that morning. "I was wondering if you could help me," she said, approaching.
"I'll help you, love,"
said one of the boys who sported peroxide blonde hair. His friends chuckled at his response until Louise took out her warrant card. "That's good to know," she said, holding up the photo from Martin Rennick's driving license she'd been sent by Graves in South Africa. "I'm looking for this man. Might go by the name of Martin." Peroxide Blonde was now hyper-compliant.
"No, I don't think so," he said, shaking his head. "There were a couple of lads in those 2 tents over there," he said, pointing 100 yards down the field. "What's he done?" said one of the others. Short and stocky with a shaved head, he'd been the only one not to laugh at Peroxide's joke. "It's very important that we speak to him." The young man considered that for a moment. "Can I see that photo again, please?" he said. His politeness and clear way of speaking made Louise think he might be military. She showed him the photo on her mobile again, which he zoomed in on. "I can't be sure if it was him, but there was a guy staying in a small tent on his own over there. I only noticed him as he was packing in a rush a few hours ago. And looking at that driving license, he's from South Africa?"
"Yes," said Louise. The man shrugged.
"Could be nothing, but he was wearing a South Africa rugby shirt."
Louise called over Coulson and Tracy and asked the young man to lead them to the spot on the edge of the site.
"Probably there," said the man, pointing to the discarded tent pegs.
Coulson sent another ping to see if the phone was still in the area, only for Tracy to step into the trees and then return a few moments later, having recovered the remains of an old Nokia brick phone. Chapter 32. Alone in the courtyard, wearing his suit, Finch could have easily believed that he was free. Only the sight of the prison guard, Wilson, in his periphery, and the locked gates, dispelled that notion. He counted as he paced, waiting for his transportation to the court for the first day of his trial. The early morning air still had a cold snap to it, but he kept the same steady pace he did every time he was ushered to this place, refusing to bend even to the weather. Hearing the rattle of the gates and some muted voices, he continued his circuit, not looking over until his name was called. "Clemens," he said as the man moved past Wilson and towards Finch. Clemens was in his prison garb. The contrast between this and Finch's suit made it appear as if things were back to normal, that Finch was here to interrogate Clemens. He held his ground but tensed his body, anticipating an attack. "Leaving us?" said Clemens, stopping a few meters short so they were not in touching distance. "Day out for good behavior." "Fancy your chances?" Finch knew he was going to be guilty of something. The charges against him were numerous, and his counsel had all but admitted that the proof was unarguable. His main concern was the charge of the attempted murder of Amira Hood. If a guilty verdict was reached for that, then he would be expecting a good decade plus inside. More if the sentencing judge had a thing against corrupt police, which most of them did. "We'll see," he said, not willing to give anything away. His best chance of escaping the charge was by discrediting Louise Blackwell's testimony. She had been present on the evening when he had tried to kill Amira Hood. Because of their history, in particular their fallout at the Walton farm, his plan had been to allege that everything had been set up by Louise, and he was a victim of entrapment. It was a long shot, but he needed to put doubt into the jurors' minds. "Things went smoothly last week. I believe your ex-colleague, Thomas Ireland, was arrested," said Clemens. The drug raid in Thornbury had been Clemens' idea. In return for seeing to it that DS Eddie Perkins turned a blind eye to a drug delivery in the Avonmouth docks, Clemens had arranged for a small stash of drugs to be placed in the vans that belonged to Ireland's delivery crew, as well as the attack that had alerted the police. Finch knew that Thomas hadn't been arrested, but he had been called in for questioning, and Finch had been able to exploit that fact with the help of the journalist Tanya Elliott. Finch nodded. "You think I'm wearing a wire?" said Clemens, pulling up his jumper. "What do you want?" Clemens pretended to recoil, as if hurt by Finch's comment. "Don't be like that, DCI Finch," he said. "Wilson," said Finch, calling over to the prison guard. Okay. Listen, that was a good bit of work we did together. It's fine. You don't have to admit it out loud," said Clemens, holding up his hand. "Our shipment arrived perfectly, and your man Perkins cleared the way for us." "I have no idea what you're talking about," said Finch. "Blackwell's boyfriend has had his reputation ruined, and I'm sure you could use that during your trial." Finch unbuttoned the top button of his shirt. "Do you have a point, Clemens?" "Whether you stay in or you go, I think we could work together. Don't you?" Under any other circumstances, Finch would have laughed in the man's face or done something much worse. But, like it or not, things had changed. Even if he could get off the attempted murder charge, he was bound to face some time inside, and that meant humoring people like the man before him. "What do you want?" "Your friend, Eddie Perkins. I'd like to add him to the payroll." "What has that to do with me?" "You would get a cut, naturally. On the outside or in. Inside, you would be guaranteed our protection, which, if you are released into the wild, could be worth its weight in gold." Finch recalled Perkins' last words. "This will be it, boss." He'd known then that those words meant very little. Perkins would bend to his will with a little pressure, and if applying that pressure meant Finch had to cozy up to Clemens, then so be it. "I'll be seeing Perkins this week," he said. "Good. Good. We'll get the details to you," said Clemens. Finch dropped his head a half-inch. "Now, if you could excuse me, I have a date with my biographer," he said, leaving Clemens in the middle of the prison yard as he walked back towards the gates. Chapter 33. A police presence was already in force when Louise drove Emily to school. Patrol cars and vans were spread along the promenade, and officers were visible on the street. Despite the explosion at the school on Saturday, the implied threat in Carl Innsgrove's suicide note was being taken seriously. More so now they had another credible suspect in Martin Walton Rennick. After the discarded phone had been discovered, a search team had recovered the remains of a SIM card, broken into numerous pieces. Coulson had been unable to recover any data from the card, and had spent the evening working on Justin Walton's phone, but no messages between Justin Walton and Martin Walton Rennick had been recovered. Holds had been placed on Martin's debit and credit cards, but since his entry into the UK he hadn't used either, which suggested he had other, untraceable means of funding himself. Louise pulled up outside the school, parking next to a patrol car she'd insisted stay outside the building all day. She'd initially wanted to keep Emily off, but Adam King had agreed to do another sweep of the building earlier that morning, and his findings had reassured her that there was no imminent threat to the school. It was still difficult letting Emily go after hugging her goodbye in the playground, which was as full as Louise had ever seen it. Once again, she sensed the parents converging, shooting odd glances her way as if she was to blame for the situation. "Strange times," said Graham Pritchard, stepping towards her as she was about to get in her car. He was dressed in a smart-looking suit that she'd never seen him wear before. "Sure is," she said, pulling her car door open. "Do you know what happened to the school hall?" he asked, as if they were co-conspirators. "As much as you, Graham." "I doubt that's true," he said, moving a step closer so she could smell his aftershave. "I can't talk about it." "You must think they're safe, though, if you're bringing Emily here. I guess it was a final passing shot from the caretaker." "I told you, I can't talk about it," said Louise, trying not to lose her cool. Everyone was naturally a little on edge, and she understood his concern. The truth was, she didn't yet fully understand Carl Innsgrove's involvement in any of this. In many ways, she hoped Graham was right. That Innsgrove had been responsible from the beginning, that the explosion on Saturday was his last act, and that they could all be free of worry. Unfortunately, Max Walton's son being in the country meant this was far from a definite reality. "I understand. It's such a shame about that cleaner." "Hannah Sanchez," said Louise. "Yes. I hope the school do something special for her and her family." "Have you told Emily about what actually happened?" Emily was too familiar with death and tragedy for any age, let alone her 7 years. She'd lost both her parents and had seen things in her time that would have tested any adult, Louise included. She'd wanted to talk to Emily about Hannah, but had been forced to pass that duty on to Emily's grandparents, as she'd been at work until the early hours. "We explained that there was a terrible accident. And you, with Toby?" "Same. It's so difficult. He was with his mum this weekend, so she spoke to him," said Graham. "It's horrible that they have to deal with this." "It is." "Have a nice day, Graham. Off anywhere special?" asked Louise, stepping into the car. Graham's face lit up as if she'd offered him the greatest compliment of his life. "Oh, this?" he said, pulling at his suit.
job interview."
"Best of luck," said Louise, shutting the door and glancing at her phone as she waited for the dad to leave. Instinctively, she went to her text thread with Thomas. Both of them had been keen to take their relationship slowly, but this felt like the longest time they hadn't properly spoken since they'd got together. It was understandable with recent events and her excessive workload, but she felt as if it was coming to some sort of breaking point. "This is ridiculous," she said to herself, typing out a text message. "Hi. Feels like I haven't seen you in ages. Shall we try and meet up tonight? Kiss." She waited a couple of minutes, but the message remained unread, so she set off for her next port of call, the Crown Court, where Finch's trial was due to begin. Louise had been present at court for hundreds of cases over the years, but this wasn't like anything she'd faced before. It was the first time she'd be called as a witness rather than as an arresting officer. There were so many charges and so many credible witnesses that it was almost inevitable Finch would face a custodial sentence. Yet she felt a sense of trepidation as she entered the building. Her chest tightened at the thought that Finch could somehow wrangle his way out of the charge of attempted murder. Yes, she would be pleased if he was found guilty of his other crimes, but she needed the attempted murder charge to stick more than any of the others. After that night at his house when she'd rescued Amira and broken Finch's leg, she'd thought it had been the end of things. Finch had all but ruined her life ever since Max Walton's death, and at last she'd felt as if she'd got some closure. But now she realized that closure would only come if he went down for the longest time possible, and if the world finally knew who Finch truly was. Amira was waiting for her in one of the small interview rooms. She was with Anthony Meads and the prosecution barrister for the trial, Amanda Knight. Knight was a first-rate barrister who'd worked on cases with Louise before, as well as occasionally being an opposing defense barrister. "Mr. Finch has hired some bigwig QC from London, who I can assure you will not be working on legal aid," she said, as they talked through the procedure for the coming week. "I wonder where he got the money from for that," said Louise, exchanging a knowing look with Amira, who was biting her nails. "It makes no difference to our case. Facts are facts. As long as you're both singing from the same hymn sheet, we'll be fine," said Knight, who'd grilled them both on numerous occasions over the last few months in preparation for this week. "When do you think I'll be needed?" asked Louise. "Depends how long Charles Boothroyd QC intends to prolong events, although I don't imagine it will be until Wednesday or Thursday at the earliest. We have a lot to get through before then, so my guess would be Thursday. Of course, they may decide to target only one or two of our witnesses, so could keep the cross-examination to a minimum. We'll know better later in the day." "I'm going to struggle to be here most of the time." Knight bit her lower lip and looked over at Meads, as if for support. "I understand, but the more you can be here, the better. I want the jury to see you as much as possible, to understand what you've gone through. Both of you," she added, looking at Amira. The clerk knocked on the door and told them to get ready. Louise walked with Amira to the court. "You okay?" she asked. "Yes. It's just I haven't seen him since that night. Not sure I want to see him again." Louise leaned in close to Amira. "Fuck him, Amira. This isn't about him. This is about all the women whose lives he's destroyed. He tried to kill you, but he's behind bars now. There's a reason for that, remember? You. If you hadn't had the bravery to come to me in the first place, we would never be here. A few more days, and he'll be out of our lives for good. Yes?" "Okay," said Amira, forcing a smile. Louise reached out for the other woman's hand as Finch was led in. It was strange seeing him again, especially under custody. She'd hoped that his time on remand and the injury she had inflicted on him that night would have had a greater effect. But aside from the affectation of a walking stick, he looked no different to when she'd last seen him. He was dressed in one of the suits he'd always worn for work, and it was hard for her to truly believe he was on trial and wasn't there working. As they stood for the judge, Finch sneaked a look at Louise. She might have been imagining it, but she was sure she could smell his citrus aftershave drifting towards her as he looked away, not acknowledging her presence. Louise tried not to stare back at Finch as Amanda Knight set out the prosecution's case and the various charges against him. As she'd expected, Finch was impossible to read. He remained passive as Knight accused him of betraying the trust not only of those he'd worked with, but the general public. Louise glanced around the viewing gallery as name after name was read out of the women Finch had abused over the years. And finally, we will provide evidence that Mr. Finch forcibly took hostage a former colleague of his, Ms. Amira Hood, and planned on taking Ms. Hood's life and that of one of his other former colleagues, D.I. Louise Blackwell, said Knight. Louise did her best not to react, taking hold of Amira's arm once more and tightening her grip as she kept her gaze forwards towards the judge. She let out a breath as Knight took a seat, memories from that night, Amira tied up, Finch waving the kitchen knife around like a baton, and the cracking sound as Finch planted his leg and she kicked out at his knee, flashing through her mind. She glanced over at Finch, who'd stirred enough to slowly shake his head in denial of the charges. It was this more than anything else at that moment that provoked her anger. How dare he, after everything he'd done, sit there with that look of victimhood, as if he'd done nothing wrong? Charles Boothroyd QC made a relaxed introduction that Louise had heard 100 times before. As most defense barristers did, he amplified the fact that the jurors had to be certain beyond all reasonable doubt that his client was guilty of the charges. Louise wanted to stand and argue when he went on to paint Finch as a victim. A hard-working police officer of nearly 2 decades, Finch had had to deal with the type of hardened criminals that most people, even most police officers, would not deal with, he argued. According to Boothroyd, Finch had endured peak psychological damage during his time in the force that had led to a breakdown, during which he'd had the altercation with Amira and Louise. He'd never meant to hurt anyone, and since his time on remand, he'd been having daily meetings with a psychologist. The QC stopped short of blaming Louise for Finch's situation, but hinted that he'd been unfairly treated, and even went so far as to mention the injury he'd sustained to his leg. It was laughable, and Louise had heard it all before. But it was still galling to hear such a defense. What Boothroyd failed to mention was that Finch had received his broken leg during his knife attack on Louise, as Amira was tied up in the kitchen. She looked forward to explaining that to the jury later in the proceedings, but for now had to reluctantly keep quiet. It became apparent from the opening witness statement that Boothroyd was going to interrogate each and every prosecution witness for all his worth. He was trying to put doubt into the minds of the jurors and was prepared to do whatever he could to make that happen, including character assassination to make their testimony appear unsound. The first woman on the stand, Lindsay Saunders, had worked as a civilian office manager in Portishead during the period when Finch had first started in CID. She told the court how Finch had seduced her before trying to hound her out of the department. The QC tried to turn it round on the woman, and by the time he'd finished with her and the judge had called recess, she was in a flood of tears. Louise met with Anthony Meads in the coffee shop area.
"He's not going to go easy, is he?" she said to the solicitor.
"We never expected it any other way. It doesn't make a difference. He can try that with all the witnesses, but the fact is we have overwhelming evidence. He can try and paint Finch as this victim, but it isn't going to work. As long as
Amira and I don't fuck up?"
"That wasn't going to be my choice of words exactly," said Meads with a grin. "We have the recording from that night, and I would suggest that Finch all but incriminates himself. However, there will be pressure on you. But I think you know that."
Louise nodded. "I need to get back to Weston. You'll keep me updated?"
"Blow by blow," said Meads.
Louise took a coffee up to Amira before leaving. She was about to enter the briefing room when along the corridor she caught sight of Tanya Elliott leaving another office. The journalist hadn't seen her, and Louise ducked behind a pillar as she moved off. It didn't take long to find out who Tanya had been talking to. A couple of minutes later, Finch's solicitor left the same office. Chapter 34. Louise watched Tanya Elliott head back into court before Louise returned outside. What the hell was the journalist playing at? Louise knew for certain that Tanya had posted articles on the Finch case already. Louise could accept that the woman was talking to Finch's brief, but if she'd been talking to Finch himself... She took a deep breath. Finch's legal team would never have been so stupid as to have allowed that to happen. If Tanya had spoken to Finch and was using her articles as a means of influencing the case, it could throw the whole trial in the air. Louise had more pressing problems to deal with, however. A haggle of journalists, TV cameras included, were outside the courthouse, as if waiting in ambush. Louise started with the only words she was going to use. "No comment," as the questions kept coming. Some were regarding the case. What was it like seeing your former colleague in the box? Do you think DCI Finch will face a prison sentence? And Louise's personal favourite, do you think he's guilty? But as she walked briskly towards the car park, the questions became more personal. Is it true you're in a relationship with Thomas Ireland? And as she was getting into her car, she heard, "Do you think the previous accusation of unlawful killing will count against you?" So there it was. If it was already a question on the lips of the journalists, then it was sure to be an angle used for the defense team. Louise slammed the car door shut, when what she wanted to do was to hold an impromptu press conference and explain again that she'd already been cleared of any wrongdoing. She checked her phone before setting off, not surprised but frustrated to see Thomas hadn't responded. Visions of the night at the Walton farm played on her mind as she made her way back to Weston. The remoteness of the place with its abandoned farming equipment, its sties and stables reeking of the rotting corpses of dead animals, was never far from her thoughts. She'd visited many times, but that night it had felt more sinister than before. More than likely it was hindsight talking, but as she'd moved through the pig sheds and up to the main farmhouse, she'd been sure something momentous was about to happen. "You will not let this get to you," she said, shaking her head to get rid of the unwanted memories. Somehow she'd already arrived in Weston. She could barely recall the journey, her body and mind working on autopilot as she pulled up outside the Holy Trinity Church Hall. She took another look at her phone. Still no message from Thomas, before walking over to the church hall. A thin, wiry man in his 70s greeted her as she opened the door.
"D.I. Blackwell?"
he said. Louise nodded. "And you must be Bryce Milner," she said, recalling the man's Welsh accent from their brief phone call.
"I am indeed. Please, come in. Can I get you anything?"
We have the finest breakfast tea and instant coffee you can get."
"I'm fine, Mr. Milner, thank you." Mr. Milner headed the war veterans group that Carl Innsgrove had attended. "When was the last time you saw Mr. Innsgrove?" asked Louise, as she sat down on one of the chairs in the middle of the hall.
"Bryce, please." "He called me after that hoax bomb was found at the school," said Bryce, leaving a one-chair gap between them as he sat down. "Told me he was unlikely to attend the meeting that week."
"It's Thursday nights you usually meet?"
"That's correct. I asked him if everything was okay. He sounded a bit shook up, but I never expected he would—"
Bryce looked away, as if caught in a distant memory.
"Then again, I didn't expect he would be subjected to such an ordeal in the first place. I presume there will be an inquiry."
Louise wasn't sure if Bryce was accusing her of something. His tone was blunt, and there was an underlying suggestion that the police's involvement had resulted in Innsgrove's death. "It's an ongoing investigation," she said, not willing to get into a discussion about it.
"There was an explosion at the school after he died, though, wasn't there?"
"That is true. I can't discuss that any further, but I can assure you everything will be getting our fullest attention." Bryce murmured something under his breath, as if half satisfied by what he'd been told.
"A terrible loss."
"Had you known Carl for long?"
"I set up this group about 10 years ago. I'd recently moved to the area and used to attend a similar group in Taunton, where I'd been living. The thing is, for those not from a military background, that type of life is unimaginable. It's not like the movies or television shows, you see. You probably understand a bit, being in the police. I don't know."
He paused again, lost in thought.
"I guess it's a cliché, but war changes you, whatever your direct involvement. It's not just the death, the terrible injuries, though that would do it, wouldn't it?" said Bryce, laughing.
"I'm sure this group was a great comfort to Carl."
"Oh, it was. That's why he called me, you see. Hated to miss a meeting. Hated it. We have some young lads who attend nowadays. Respectful boys. They listen to what Carl and us old-timers have to say. Carl used to like that. Gave him the opportunity to pass on his experience, and at the same time to discuss things he wouldn't usually share."
"Could you tell me some more about Carl? I know he used to be in the Navy and was involved in the Falklands conflict." Bryce's eyes narrowed, and as he studied her, she saw his age in the deep grooves on his face. He seemed to oscillate between friendliness and distrust, as if he didn't quite know how to take her.
"You know I can't share details about what goes on here," he said.
"I understand there are matters of confidentiality you have to uphold, but there are parts of Carl's life we don't know enough about. We haven't ruled out the possibility of something happening again in town," she said, not yet willing to divulge details about the latest phone message. Bryce appeared to mull that over. Concentrating, his face was a canvas of lines, but despite his age, she sensed an underlying strength to the man.
"He served on HMS Coventry. Did you know that? He was on it when those bombs were dropped. He was lucky to escape."
"I didn't know that. I thought he was serving on a different ship."
"He was on HMS Bristol, but he'd been transferred a few days before to the Coventry. He was trapped on board for 20 minutes as it was going down. He saw some terrible things," said Bryce, scowling. "His friends burning,
he added, displaying his teeth as he shook his head. The connection was obvious, and she could see in Bryce's eyes that he understood it too. Mrs. Harrison had told her about Innsgrove's drug problems after leaving the Navy, but had never been clear on the actual details. Did he ever get help for what happened to him? Beyond this group, obviously. There was less help available back then, and it's not much better nowadays. I'm sure you're aware the path Carl took with the drink and the drugs, but he'd put that all behind him. And I know what you're thinking about his experiences defining his subsequent actions, but I simply can't imagine it. He was involved, Bryce. There's no way to get away from that. Our concern now is that he may have been working with someone, and that person remains a potential threat. What? No, said Bryce, shaking his head. Is there anyone in the group Carl was particularly close to? As I said, Carl got along with everyone. The younger guys looked up to him. And the older guys? Us older guys liked him too, said Bryce with a smile. Did any of you serve with him, or were in the Falklands at the same time? Bryce placed his hand over his mouth in consideration. You think we're running some sort of terrorism cell here? Is that it? Old men getting back on a society that failed them? Blowing up school buildings in a desperate bid to get attention? Don't talk stupid. No one is saying that, Bryce, but it is highly likely that Mr. Innsgrove wasn't working alone, so I think it is a legitimate question to ask. The only other guy who was in the Falklands was Ben. Ben Coles. But he was a paratrooper. They'd never met before this group was formed. You have an address for Mr. Coles? This is ludicrous, said Bryce, getting up and retrieving an old address book which he opened for her. Louise took a photo of Coles' address before handing her card to Bryce. I realize this is a horrible reality to consider, but if you can think of anything else that could help us, please call me. You're only doing your job. I know that. If you'd only heard him talk here, you would be as surprised as I am. Still trying to get my head around it. I do understand. If it's any comfort, I believe Carl was highly conflicted over what happened. He knew he was acting out of character. That's why it's important we find whoever was helping him. I'll speak to the others. See what I can do, said Bryce, his eyes reddening as he saw her to the door. Chapter 35. It was fun being on the other side for once. Finch was well aware that being the defendant played to his ego, but he didn't care about that. He was happy to be center stage, relished the challenge that fat bitch of a barrister had set out with her opening statement. He had to be careful, though, his team had advised him, as if he'd been born yesterday. He tried to look contrite, but not guilty, as if he knew he'd done something wrong, but it wasn't as bad as they were making out. Now and again, he would sneak shy glances at the jurors to impress upon them his fragility. It was an act, but he'd been acting most of his life. Blackwell had fucked off after recess. He was glad not to feel her eyes boring into him. During the break, he'd arranged for his solicitor to meet the journalist Tanya Elliott. She'd always been an aggravating presence in his working life. But now the tables had turned. The quality he'd once so detested in her, her single-mindedness, could potentially do him a favor. She'd already begun the work she'd promised, and with the information he'd supplied her today, the hope was that by the time Louise Blackwell came to the dock, she would be a wreck in the eyes of the jurors and everyone involved in the case. For now, Finch had to be content watching his QC ripping to shreds every witness they put before him. Finch had been careful over the years. He'd used untraceable phones for all his conquests, and so much of the evidence being given was circumstantial, and Boothroyd was using that to his advantage. Where he'd royally fucked up was keeping images of the women he'd manipulated on his laptop. He'd tried to delete them moments before he'd been ambushed by Blackwell, but everything had happened too fast. The plan in these circumstances was to get the jurors to believe he'd had permission to take those images. In most of the cases, that was true enough, and it was Boothroyd's job to create just enough doubt that they considered that a possibility. The judge ended the day just as night was getting going with the evidence surrounding Ruby Williams, a once pretty little redhead who'd worked in the PR team at headquarters. It must have only been 6 or 7 years ago, but how the woman had let herself go. In some ways, it was embarrassing having her up there. She'd either had kids or had been eating her feelings over these last few years, and the look was not a good one. The only consolation was that it must be difficult for the jurors to accept her tale of sex and deception, as it was hard enough to imagine anyone wanting to have sex with her in the first place. Finch stood like a good boy as the judge did his thing before breaking for lunch. Be contrite and respectful. He was taken to a holding cell where he was given his daily gruel before being led to the prison van where Wilson had arranged for him to meet Eddie Perkins. "Give us 5, Wilson, will you?" said Finch. Wilson knew better than to argue, and the guard in the driver's seat was keen to be literally looking the other way. "What the hell am I doing here?" said Perkins. "Calm down, Eddie. I wanted to see you while we still have time. Who knows where they'll end up sending me if this goes tits up." Perkins pursed his lips, doing his best to pretend he had the power of thought. "Everything went smooth," he said, no doubt calculating what the chances actually were of Finch being moved out of the region. "I know, Eddie. Mr. Clemens was very impressed. That's why I wanted to speak to you." "Mr. Clemens," said Perkins. "That's what he'd like you to call him from now on, Eddie. Now that you're going into business with him." Chapter 36. Whatever Farrell's thoughts were about Eddie Perkins, he was unsure about the ethics of tailing another officer. He'd done it the first time out of nagging doubt, and now he was struggling to justify it to himself. Yes, Perkins had met with Tanya Elliott, but that was hardly a crime. Farrell had spoken to her on a number of occasions himself. Although Perkins' meeting with her had occurred around the same time articles were appearing in the paper about Thomas and Louise, that in itself didn't justify the off-the-books surveillance. He'd convinced himself that there was something off about Perkins, but had to concede he was working on little more than a hunch. He had to admit, too, that he was naturally biased against the man, as he was the last man standing of Finch's inner circle. None of which made the confines of the front seat of his car any easier to bear. He'd expected Perkins to end up at the courthouse at some point that day, taking a chance, parking close to the building, with a sightline to the main entrance on Small Street. Perkins had arrived shortly before Louise left for the day. Farrell decided to await the man's return in the car, as there was little to be gained from watching Perkins inside, where, no doubt, he was going to watch the freak show that was the Finch trial. He'd had to endure watching Louise being harassed by reporters as she'd made her way to her car, when he'd wanted to jump out and smash some heads together. They had no idea what Louise had gone through with Finch, Not that they'd care if they did. He only hoped that soon they would be seeing the back of the man for good, and that Perkins and his ilk would become a thing of the past. Farrell received notification that Finch's trial was done for the day, 30 minutes before Perkins left the building. Perkins appeared to be in a furious mood, his body tensed as he barged past the reporters who were paying him no attention. Farrell didn't have time to ponder why, but as he pulled away to follow Perkins, who was on foot, a prison van pulled out of the car park beneath the courthouse. Farrell couldn't tell for sure if Finch was in the back of the van, but he did wonder if Perkins had managed to speak to his old colleague before leaving. It wasn't allowed, but wasn't beyond the realm of possibility. Farrell watched the van pull away and arrived on Key Street in time to see Perkins get in his car. Farrell had thought ahead and borrowed a friend's car for the day, but it was still a risky procedure. Perkins wouldn't be expecting it, but if he had his wits about him, he would notice at some point that he was being followed. It was a way of thinking ingrained into them in the police. So Farrell had to stay as far back as he was able without risking losing him. Fortunately, his job was made easier by the slow-moving traffic out of the center. He was at least 10 cars behind Perkins as they made their way past Anchor Road. Farrell kept far back and was relieved when, a few minutes later, Perkins took the turning to Brandon Hill, the public park that was the home of the Cabot Tower. Farrell parked on the road and waited until Perkins left his car before following on foot. One thing Farrell knew for sure was that Perkins was not a lover of exercise or the outside. This wasn't a recreational visit, and he doubted Perkins would have chosen the park as a suitable meeting venue. Farrell had decided on a pair of hiking boots that morning, though as he followed along the pathway, the decision felt like overkill. Perkins was moving at a tragically slow pace, and twice Farrell had to drop to his knee to pretend to tie his shoe as the other detective stopped to catch his breath. As Perkins reached the adventure playground area, Farrell checked his watch. Children of all ages swarmed the playground, and on the surrounding fields they played ball games and threw frisbees beneath the June sunshine. Some of the parents joined in with their offspring, while others took welcome breaks on the park benches, a few of them reading, but most stuck to their phones or in conversation with one another. Farrell took the long way round as Perkins made his way over to a group of 3 men huddled beneath a giant oak tree. All 3 of the men were smoking and paid no attention to any of the children as Perkins sauntered over to them. Farrell had witnessed these types of exchanges before. He could see from the men's body language that Perkins wasn't welcome, 2 of the men looking him up and down as they dragged on their cigarettes. Farrell wanted to get nearer, both to see what was going on but also to be there in case Perkins was in danger. But it would be impossible to explain his presence if he got caught. He'd brought a camera with him and began taking snaps of the numerous squirrels, trying not to stand out as he turned the camera to Perkins and his friends, the zoom lens close to maximum. Hard pumping, he put the camera on burst mode and took a set of pictures before looking away. Scrolling through the images, he could see he'd been fortunate enough to get some good shots. He had to zoom in on the image to make sure he wasn't mistaken. He didn't recognize 2 of the men, but the 3rd was definitely Michael Sinclair, the lowlife Perkins had arrested in Thornbury. The same lowlife who had tried to implicate Thomas Ireland as a drug dealer. Chapter 37. As Louise stepped out of the church hall, she checked her phone, adrenaline rushing through her body as she saw the 5 missed calls from her mother. She was on the verge of calling back when she checked her text messages and saw that she'd only been calling to tell her that Emily had been picked up from school. Why her mother had to try and call her 5 times was beyond Louise's understanding at that moment. though her annoyance was tempered by relief. Now wasn't the time to be resting on their laurels, but the later it got, the more she could hope that Carl Innsgrove's farewell warning had already been honoured by the explosion on Saturday at the school. It didn't mean they were at the end of the investigation, but the knot she'd felt in the pit of her stomach all day was easing. Now all they had to do was find out who had made the threat call following Innsgrove's death. It would be wonderful if they could explain that away as a hoax, although everything pointed to it being the desperate bid of Martin Walton Rennick in an effort to cause some disruption in the Finch trial. If and why Walton Rennick had been working with Innsgrove was a question they would need to answer sooner or later. But it was still painful to know they'd been so close the day before. What made her feel worse was that now she had to relive that experience in front of Assistant Chief Constable Brightman and the officers from CTU. She called Thomas as she parked up in Portishead 30 minutes later, and was so surprised when he picked up that she took a couple of seconds spluttering her response to his, "Hey." "Hey yourself," she finally managed. "Sorry, I was going to call you. It was the first day of the trial today, wasn't it? How did it go?" He was speaking as if nothing was amiss between them, which made the exchange even more confusing. It had been so long since she'd had a serious relationship that she'd forgotten how the day-to-day interactions could be. Had she been reading too much into recent events? Thomas had so much on his plate that it was inevitable he'd be a little bit distracted. Could it be that all the negative thoughts swarming her head had just been her overactive imagination? It wasn't too bad. Bit weird seeing Finch, though I have to say it helped a bit by seeing him with a walking stick. Good. Let's hope he has that for the rest of his life. How have you been? I know Greg had to speak to you. That was a bit shitty, but I can understand it. I have to be honest, I'm just about hanging on. With all the negative publicity, I think I'll be the one that takes the fall for this. Oh no, Tom, that's terrible. They can't do that. It wasn't your fault. I'm head of security. Anyway, when do I get to see you next? The question sounded light, but Louise sensed an awkwardness, as if it was just a little forced. I'm full on with this explosion stuff in Weston. Probably won't be until after the air show now. Okay, said Thomas, his disappointment obvious in his deflated voice. She regretted the words as soon as she'd put the phone down. She was busy, but could have made time to see him before the end of the week. She wasn't sure why she wanted to avoid him. She tried to convince herself it had nothing to do with what had happened in Thornbury and Farrell being forced to interview him. She'd made mistakes in her past, but in general she was a good judge of character, and she knew Thomas better than most. It wasn't in him to get involved in any kind of illegal activity. He'd spent so many years battling against those in the drug trade, and had seen firsthand the effects on both the end users and those involved in the production and distribution at all levels. The fact was, he wasn't stupid enough to go down that route, and with his new job, he was earning more than he'd ever had in the police, so nothing about it added up. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she was nagged by the idea that her fears were all down to her trust issues. She didn't want it to be true, but seeing Finch at the courthouse had reminded her of how foolish she'd been in the past. Now wasn't the time to dwell on that, and she forced thoughts of Finch and Thomas from her mind as she made her way to the incident room. Faulkner and Hartson were already there, sitting next to each other as if they were inseparable. "Coffee, D.I. Blackwell?" said Faulkner, getting to his feet. "No thanks," said Louise. She couldn't tell if his charm was an act or not. "How was the trial this morning?" he asked as Louise sat down.